Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm and you are watching What If Team 7 Accidentally Travel Back in Time. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
The whole point was that the mission wasn't even supposed to be hard. Sincerely, Tsunade had been anticipating it when the four original Team 7 members entered her office. Their faces ranged from adoring frustration to nearly begging, and she barely controlled her sigh without rubbing her temples. Given that Hitaki Kakashi would be formally named Konoha's new Hokage in just over a week, a role he was only reluctantly accepting, and only after being thoroughly guilt-tripped and blackmailed into it, it wasn't shocking. Which was undoubtedly not the kind of response Tsunade had in mind when she appointed her successor, having taken the job herself. Naturally, she had anticipated giving the hat to a sunny blonde with a radiant smile who had dreamed of getting it all his life, not a stubborn, awkward, and emotionally unstable pervert, but, well, right now, she didn't really have the space to be picky. Although she had managed to maintain the title for more than a year, she had started to feel extremely worn out. She was feeling older than ever before because of the toll the war had taken on her. She was able to manage the paperwork, assign missions, and give orders, but she was no longer in a position to protect her village as she should have. Tsunade wasn't the Kage who was supposed to be the strongest and most capable of protecting their people, the best defense for their village. Furthermore, Naruto wasn't prepared for it, even though she would have loved to pass the hat to him at that precise moment. He wasn't quite there yet, but he was making progress now that his time wasn't being consumed by trying to drag his teammate back while also fighting against S-ranked terrorist groups and taking part in a war that spanned the entire elemental nations. And he was as aware of it as she was. During a brief lunch one day when he had stopped by to deliver his most recent mission report, she had even asked him if he was disappointed that she hadn't put him forward for consideration. It probably wouldn't have been challenged if she had. He and his comrades were the heroes of the Fourth War, the ones who had fought Kagaya and Madara back and managed to win. Furthermore, he had good relations with several Kages and other high-ranking shinobi from various countries. No one in their village would have objected if she had chosen him because he was their darling and everyone loved him. However, he had fully understood and had not been upset. It wasn't just his strength that made him a Kage, he was stronger than most. Additionally, he had discovered during the war that he was not prepared for that level of responsibility simply because he was powerful. It was acceptable if it took a little longer, but eventually he would work hard for it as he always had until he achieved that goal. After all, he had never shied away from a challenge, and he had no intention of giving up. Which, in reality, had only given Tsunade one choice: Kakashi. He vanished for a week after seemingly realizing this at the same moment as she did. As he had never shown his face to anyone before and had undoubtedly never left the village, she suspected a henge was involved, but she couldn't be positive. After he was finally dragged back into her office by a very haggard and unimpressed Sakura, he began to list all the reasons why it was a bad idea and toss out other candidates that she should take into consideration. Naturally, all of this was a complete waste of time because she had already carefully considered all of her options, something she knew he knew, and that he was only trying desperately to avoid the inevitable. But after another week of prodding, he had finally been forced to concede defeat. Despite the fact that he was obviously unhappy and spent most of his time moping, he was also devoted to his village and understood how crucial this was. He would do it, but he would be slow about it the whole time. Which led them to this point. Even before Kakashi slouched forward to stand in front of her desk, she knew what he was going to ask for. Since the end of the war, they had all been very busy. When Sakura wasn't working on innovative limb prosthetic designs with the assistance of multiple people from the R&D department, she jumped right in. She whipped it into shape in a way that made Tsunade proud and even earned the respect of veteran medic.nin. Following his betrayal of the village and subsequent descent into madness, Sasuke had to undergo a rigorous evaluation. He was then placed on probation before being quickly abducted into Anbu once his loyalty had been proven once more. Even though he had no intention of helping with their work, Naruto had been moving between departments, spending time getting to know each one, occasionally shadowing Tsunade, and going on missions whenever he could. Kakashi had been occupied with paperwork and getting ready to be promoted to the position of leader of a hidden village. Thus, this was Kakashi's way of pleading for one final taste of freedom before he was bound to the desk she was now occupying, and consequently to paperwork and accountability. He only wanted Team 7 to have one final run before they were eliminated. And Tsunade hadn't really cared, since the blonde was officially the head of the Uzumaki clan, even though there were only 2 known members left, and because he had been studying Fuinjutsu for the past few months and was the closest thing to a seal master they had outside of herself and Hitaki, She had been planning to send Naruto out on a mission anyhow to deal with a couple of missing nin who had apparently been stupid enough to use the ruins of Uzushio as their base. She had intended to send Naruto alone because reports indicated that the missing nin was primarily composed of chunin, with only a few junin mixed in. However, she would be damned if she sent her successor on a mission that wasn't pitifully simple, especially since it was so near to her freedom. For the heroes of the Fourth Shinobi War, 4 of the strongest shinobi in existence, this mission was just that. It was meant to be simple. It should have taken them no more than a few days, mostly for travel, and there should have been no complications. Naturally, Tsunade was to blame for forgetting that this was Team 7 and that no mission remained straightforward for very long with them. If only to himself, Naruto could acknowledge that he should have anticipated this. After all, he was one of the very few who could possibly hope to avoid any stray seals that might be lying around the ruins of Uzushio, which was one of the reasons this mission had been assigned to him. Since they were in practically every line of sight, he was unsure if the missing nin had been able to evade them for this long due to their training in Fuinjutsu or simply a lot of bad luck. Though he wasn't prepared to rule out the former entirely, he was inclined to believe it was the latter. The majority of the group was made up of chunin, with 2 junin who were obviously the leaders, according to the information they had been given. Although they had a guard rotation in place, they had set up camp in what appeared to have been a town square and were all quite at ease, obviously believing they were safe there. It was not an unjust presumption. Few people, including shinobi, had the courage to enter Uzushio's ruins. Because of their power and skill, which were obvious everywhere one looked, the people here had been wiped out. When seals were involved, it was never a good idea to jump without first looking. Because of this, no one had previously come here to plunder because, at least up until now, the risk was much greater than the reward. And Naruto couldn't deny that it made him resist the impulse to snarl a little and flash his teeth. He had never met any of the people who had died here, and he would not have known their names, faces, or dreams, but they were still his family because, yes, Konoha was his home and his village. His mother had lived here for the first time. It might have been a second home to him as well if it hadn't been destroyed in such a manner. Furthermore, he was adamant that the deceased should be allowed to rest in peace, regardless of his own personal connections to the location. That should have been the world's first lesson from the Fourth War, if nothing else. Therefore, it's true that Naruto was a little more irate than he usually is during missions these days, a little more eager to kick someone in the ass and take names. And, yes, it might have made him a little more reckless and prone to revert to bad habits than were safe in a place like this, so in a way, what occurs might be his fault. But no matter how much Kurama made fun of him for it, he would never confess it. At first, everything proceeds without any problems. They wait until the sun is lowering behind them, which should reduce their target's visibility and make their approach easier to conceal, before charging at their adversaries. Naruto watches their route and prevents them from setting off any nasty seal traps. Before the others truly understand what's going on, the first 6 are taken out. Naturally, the Junin are the first to respond, interacting with Sasuke and Kakashi, Sensei, respectively, and trying to give commands to the others. However, as he and Sakura continue to cut through the rest, they are mowed down pretty quickly, so they don't really get the chance. He is aware that he isn't giving it the attention he needs and is only concerned with eliminating these nin and evacuating these ruins as soon as possible. He only has time to turn when he hears Sakura yell a warning, and he hardly gets a chance to see the seal before the man is slapping his bloodied hand against it. As a result, he fails to notice the young and desperate Chunin, the last of them alive, who launches himself at a seal that has been etched into the ground at the edge of the clearing. Anticipating that it will misfire and explode, he braces himself. He is not anticipating that the ground will appear to give way beneath him or that the world will grotesquely twist and warp. It feels like a hook to the gut, and he isn't expecting to be yanked, brutally torn, stretched, and pulled in ways he is pretty sure shouldn't be possible. He doesn't think Kurama will growl, lose his temper, or start shouting threats and profanities. He doesn't anticipate feeling as though he's catching fire and colliding with solid concrete at the same time, before his world mercifully goes dark. He certainly doesn't anticipate time travel, but he's fairly certain that no one ever does. Naruto enters his mindscape to speak with Kurama as soon as he regains consciousness. Well, given that he is currently 12 years old, his first reaction is to go into full panic. Furthermore, he actually means to be dragged into once Kurama loses his patience, when he says, "Go into." Exactly the same thing. With his arms thrashing, he screamed, "What the hell is going on?" With its chin resting on folded arms, the fox sat on the opposite side of the cavern, watching Naruto pace back and forth with a look that alternated between amusement and annoyance. Why am I sitting in what looks like my old apartment, you know, the one that was destroyed by Nagato? Better yet, why do I look like I'm 12? What even happened? Kurama sneered. What do you think happened, idiot? Obviously, the seal transported your soul, and me along with it, through time and dumped us into your younger self. With a tone full of irony, Naruto raised his arms and said, oh, obviously, time travel. Why didn't I think of that? Surely, it should have been my first guess, seeing as how it's impossible to do. Clearly not, or we wouldn't be in this mess. How do you know that's what happened? This could just be a really good genjutsu, you know. You think that hadn't occurred to me, you hairless monkey? Of course it did. One of the first things I did was disrupt your chakra just to be sure. Naruto took a breath and opened his mouth to yell back, but then he sagged. Kurama wasn't at fault, and shouting about it wouldn't make it better. Time travel, though? He inquired, his voice unable to contain his despair. Really? It wasn't that he hadn't considered it previously, particularly after he started studying Fuinjutsu theory. Because when it came to sealing, the possibilities were endless, and Naruto had plenty of them. With a wistful smile and a remark about him living up to his Uzumaki name, Tsunade. Chan had pointed out that he was learning like a sponge, even though he hadn't been knowledgeable enough to even begin on something like that. All he needed was the skill and knowledge to match. And, as he rarely did with anything in the past, he had given it careful thought. Because he could save so many lives if he could go back in time. Asuma, Sensei, Konan and Nagato, Itachi, Neji, Ero, Sennin, Jiji, and possibly even Obito. In order to give Sasuke more motivation to remain in the village, he could also attempt to save him. He could even save Zabuza and Haku, who had inspired him to pursue his dream and become stronger, if he traveled far enough back in time to safeguard those he held in high regard. At the same time, however, things had gone well, or, given everything, as good as they could have been. Following their victories over Madara and Akatsuki, they also triumphed over Kagaya. In a manner never seen before, the nations had united and fought alongside one another. Every nation was putting in more effort than ever to maintain the solid alliances that had been formed. Perhaps he had not discovered the real tranquility that Jiraiya had spoken of and that his father had dreamed of, but he had come very close, and he had no intention of jeopardizing it in any way. All of that vanished with the activation of a single seal. Yes, the deaths, but also all the advancements. With a gentle voice that no one would have believed possible even a year ago, the Kyuubi roared, yeah, Kit, but added, time travel. That was what the pulling sensation was, the seal taking hold and yanking you out of your body, through the rivers of time, and dumping you into this one. When he asked, and the feeling like I'd caught on fire, and there was no response, Naruto started to feel very uneasy. Kurama? The fox grudgingly acknowledged, that was your soul overriding the one that originally inhabited this body, while Naruto gaped in horror. Slowly, he demanded, are you telling me that I basically just killed my younger self? You didn't kill him, more like, absorbed him. That is not helping, Naruto screamed, desperately clenching his fists into his hair. The Kyuubi rolled its huge eyes and said, I don't see the problem here. Your younger soul wouldn't have even felt a thing. The only reason you felt anything was because yours was the one doing the absorbing. He's still alive, he's just a part of you now. Desperate, the blonde moaned and ran his hands down his face, saying, that's so creepy. Whatever, just move on. You're back in time, you're in your younger body, there's nothing you can do about that. What you can do is check up on those teammates of yours. I'm fairly certain all three of them also got caught up in the seal and are also here in this time. The fox closed his eyes after finishing his sentence, indicating that he was finished talking. Although he had become much more adept at civil interaction, he was still a centuries-old chakra manifestation who had been isolated behind seals for the past century without anyone with whom to communicate. It was still being worked on. With a sigh, Naruto followed instructions and left his mindscape before Kurama became irate and threw him out, as he had done before. Furthermore, he couldn't help but feel relieved that he wouldn't be isolated here. If he had been the only living person who remembered the war and had been stuck with the younger versions of everyone he had ever known, he had no idea what he would have done. He immediately folded his legs and sat motionless, drawing nature chakra to himself and expanding his senses as he did so after opening his eyes to see his old, deserted, and ruined apartment once more. Even though his team's chakra signatures were spread out across the village, they were all easily found. When they returned, Kakashi Sensei was probably standing by the memorial stone at their former training ground. Sakura felt at home when Sasuke was at the Uchiha compound, the house her family had occupied before it was destroyed along with the rest of Konoha during Pain's attack. Even if they didn't have a demon in their stomach to explain it to them through their denial, he was reasonably certain that each of them was intelligent enough to piece the puzzle together, so he wasn't overly concerned about them. Even though all the evidence already suggests that they were his teammates, it would still be a huge relief for him to be able to see them, speak with them, and know for sure that they were his teammates. With that in mind, and with the impression that Sasuke and Kakashi Sensei were already heading toward him, while Sakura was undoubtedly on the move and would probably be there shortly, Naruto leapt from his bed, stepping over the hole in the floor that was covered in open scrolls with the ease of long practice, and went to his closet to change. Orange greeted him. Lots of orange. Even though he still loved the color and always would, he could acknowledge that if this was what he wore every day as a child, perhaps he had been a little too enthusiastic. Furthermore, it wasn't like he had been dressed similarly that long ago. Hell, he'd been in his orange and black jumpsuit for the whole Fourth War. The only thing that had taught him that perhaps orange wasn't the best color for his outfit was the last few months of bouncing around the other departments and being sent on a variety of missions he had never been on before. At the very least, the expressions on his teammates' faces when he first arrived at one of their combined training sessions wearing a black and blue outfit with a faint hint of dark orange were priceless. It was made even funnier by the fact that it had taken them nearly an hour and a trip to the Yamanaka flower shop to be convinced that he was still him. However, it appeared that he was temporarily returning to wearing searing orange and blue jumpsuits. It was nostalgic, at least. It was also pretty amazing to see Sasuke actually wince as he saw it while scaling the window he had opened for them. The Uchiha sighed and bemoaned. I truly thought I'd never have to see that monstrosity again. I kind of missed it. I think I'm going to wear it all the time, Naruto said, trying to maintain the most innocent expression on his face. Naruto, it's not nice to pick on your teammates. Another presence appeared before Sasuke's face had fully twisted into genuine horror. Sakura nodded, trailing their sensei by a single step. Besides, even if you were serious, we'd burn the things before you got a chance, Sakura said. Naruto pouted and said, that's really mean, but he let it go. They were right. With his hands in his pockets, Kakashi began, so, while Sakura shut the window after them. Even Anbu had no chance of listening in on this conversation after Sasuke applied a series of hand seals. Time travel, huh? Sakura narrowed her eyes at him. You are way too happy about this. I have no idea what you mean, he replied in a flat voice, his eyes curving into what was clearly supposed to be a naive smile. Of course he's happy, Sasuke quipped, this means he's not becoming Hokage in week. Kakashi repeated, his face unchanged despite his almost manic glee. I have no idea what you mean, he said. Sakura rolled her eyes, but she didn't say anything more. If the calendar on my wall was correct, and there isn't any reason for it not to be, then tomorrow is team assignment day. Or, well, today. That's really far back, Naruto sighed, not surprisingly anyway. When he realized he was using his right hand, he flinched after rubbing at his forehead. Sasuke was crossing his arms awkwardly, but he wasn't the only one who felt extremely uneasy about a limb's abrupt return after more than a year of acclimating to its absence. At least we won't have to stack the team or anything. As it is, nothing we do now should change that, Sakura added, absently glancing around the room. When Naruto was unable to suppress a snort, they instantly sharpened and snapped back to him. We would have been assigned the same team anyways, he told her, settling into the lonely chair beside his small kitchen table. Team 10 and Team 8 were made for info gathering and tracking, and they're both second-generation team formations. Which leaves Sasuke and I left over, of the graduates that more or less had to pass their sensei's genin test, which left us together. And Kakashi. Sensei would have been assigned to us because he's the only one with a Sharingan to teach Teme over here. You're the only one who would have been an unknown, Sakura, since you're not a clan kid, but with your intelligence they would have been stupid not to assign you with us. His words were met with silence, and when he looked up, he saw that all three of them were staring at him, despite Sasuke's best efforts to hide it. He was forced to frown. When Sakura at least had the grace to look sheepish, he huffed, what? I've been shadowing Ba-chan all year, you really think I haven't learned anything? After she shrugged and said, sorry, Naruto, it's just weird hearing you be so logical when you look like that, he had to give her that one. For fear of Sasuke never, ever letting it go, he would never publicly acknowledge it, but he had undoubtedly been a bit of a fool as a child. He was made aware of how much Kurama considered that to be an understatement by a mocking snort from his mind. Can we get back on track? We're in the past, most of us are 12. What the hell are we gonna do? Moaned Naruto, rolling his eyes at his team and his inner demon. Sasuke grudgingly acknowledged, he has a point, which was impolite. Can we even do anything? My body is definitely, ridiculously out of shape, but my chakra reserves feel about the same as they were in the future. At that, they all winced together because his body wasn't the only one. Sakura held up a hand and let it glow green for a moment, admitting, my reserves feel the same, too, and my control seems just as good. However, my body has hardly any muscle mass. Hardly any mass at all, really, which is just unhealthy, and my strength of 100 seal is gone, which is annoying. Kurama's seal stayed open, thankfully. Naruto didn't even want to consider the consequences of what might have occurred. If that had been the case, he would have felt terrible. And my reserves have always been huge, so I'm guessing they're the same. If my control didn't come back with me, I might actually cry. That wasn't even an exaggeration, which was unfortunate. He had battled valiantly to maintain his control, and even then, it wasn't very strong. It would have been hell to have to start over from scratch, unable to even climb a tree. The teacher, who had not yet spoken, was slouched against the wall with his nose deep in his book when the three of them turned to face him as one. Sakura's eyes twitched as she demanded, really? Sasuke and Naruto cautiously backed away from her after spotting the warning indications of an impending explosion. We're over 5 years in the past and you're reading porn? The man calmly told her, I can multitask, without even raising his head. My reserves are the same, though like you three, my body is a bit out of shape. Easy enough to rectify. We're working together as a team to figure out what happened and to plan out what to do now. As our leader, it's your responsibility to be a part of this discussion, don't you think? Sakura said with a sweet smile. Kaka. Sensei, and Sasuke and Naruto dropped all pretense at this point, simply plastering themselves to the wall behind her, hopefully out of danger. Ma, in just a moment, Sakura-chan. I just got to the part where Aki seduces the... Sakura's fist remained raised as she cautiously stepped over the debris in pursuit, and Naruto couldn't help but thank the sage that all the other tenants in this building had moved out years ago because they didn't want to be that close to the fox brat. Both boys flinched as their teacher crashed through the wall he'd been leaning against. If not, there would have likely been a lot of uncomfortable questions. As sounds of pain reverberated from the opposite side of the wall, Sasuke remarked dryly, I take it we won't be lying low and hiding our abilities, and began to relax. As long as they didn't aggravate her further, they should be safe now that she was venting all of her resentment on her target. As her former crush, Sasuke may have believed that he would be immune to Sakura's incredible power. In less than a month, he had discovered that this was not at all the case and that, despite her forgiveness, she still had a great deal of resentment toward him. It's best not to give her an excuse. Nah, Naruto said with ease as he plopped back into the chair after it had fallen from the shockwave. I think you and Kaka Sensei would have been the only ones able to pull that off. I'm not really good at hiding, obviously, and Sakura tends to forget herself when she's mad. It would have only been a matter of time before she punted one of us through a wall in front of witnesses. Sasuke let out a sigh but did not object. It was true, so there was no point. Naruto went on, his eyes narrowed as he considered, but even if we're not concealing our powers, we might be able to pass it off without actually admitting to time travel, because we're all going to be training pretty hard. Everyone knows that Sensei is a genius, and they all say that you are, too, so it won't surprise them if you get strong quickly. Sakura is thought of as only book smart, but she's always had a natural talent in chakra control. And as for me, well, Iruka Sensei was pretty much the only one who didn't go out of their way to sabotage me when I was younger, and after a while I just decided to do things my own way. With a teacher who's actually teaching me, it's not all that unbelievable that I'd get good pretty quickly. As Naruto walked away, he noticed Sasuke's face turning into a grimace and couldn't help but smile at him. Since his teammates were only children, he had never held them responsible for his upbringing. It wasn't really their fault. Being the last surviving student of his father, he had been a little resentful that Kakashi Sensei had never come forward, but he had moved on quickly enough. Even though he wasn't present during his early years, Naruto felt that the man's presence since then made up for it. And even if it didn't, not completely, there wasn't much that could be done at this point. There would be no benefit to harboring resentment or hatred. It would be best to simply accept his presence in his life and move on. Naruto went on, nobody really knows any of us, anyway, right now. Iruka Sensei and Gigi might be a bit confused, but that's about it. None of us have friends, not really, so it's not like any of our classmates can tell the difference. So long as our personalities don't do a complete turnaround, we should be fine. Their sensei concurred, that's very true, as he ascended the crater he had been blasted through. He appeared fine, although he was much more scuffed than he had been previously, walked with a slight limp, and his book was conspicuously missing. Sakura appeared smugly content as she passed behind him. You should be fine, Sasuke, as you tend to lean more towards complete social avoidance. Still, if it's not the members of Team 7 that you're interacting with. The hypocrite that Naruto coughed into his fist was not taken seriously. Obviously, all three of you have matured quite a bit, but you've all kept the main parts of your personalities. All you have to do is play those up during the team assignments and you should be fine. After that, interaction with your fellow graduates will be rare for a while as all the teams settle in. After that period of time, bigger changes in your actions won't seem all that odd. Sakura crossed her arms thoughtfully and said, so, basically, we pretend to be our 12-year-old selves in class tomorrow, but afterwards we won't have to bother. Seems simple enough. All I've really got to do is go around with my hands clasped, yelling, Sasuke-kun. Sasuke-kun. And nobody should really be able to tell the difference. Sasuke grimaced, obviously not anticipating it at all, but he remained silent. He could take it for a day, and they had a point. Hopefully. Remember that you and Ino are currently rivals in love, Naruto chuckled, taking pleasure in the Uchiha's increasingly distressed expression. You're both fighting for Tomi's affections and the right to be called his #1 fan. Sakura palmed her face and moaned, then pushed her hair back almost violently. Yeah, I remember. Tragically, Naruto wasn't lying when he said, all we need to do is for me to be extremely loud and annoying and for Sasuke to be silent and glare at everything. It probably only took that to make everyone in their class believe that nothing had changed from before. All three men quickly moved away from their pink-haired teammate when they heard a sudden chuckle. Alternatively, Naruto could lean as far away as he could without tipping over his chair and falling to the ground. He said, Sakura-chan. With caution, she assured them, nothing, in a manner that didn't make them feel any better. Just remembering something that happened last time around. You know, it only just now occurred to me that you're both mine and Sasuke's first kiss, aren't you, Naruto? As Naruto struggled to stop it, he could feel his face turning red. That wasn't my fault. That kid bumped into me. And you were performing CPR, that doesn't count, you know. Sasuke smirked and said, I don't know, adding, you were also my second kiss. That's a pattern forming. Sakura's eyes were wide as she demanded, what? When? How come I never heard about this? Never, it never happened, stressed Naruto frantically. Sakura muttered, that means I'm losing, while holding her hand to her chin thoughtfully and ignoring the fact that her words had Naruto's face practically on fire. But don't worry, I'm sure I'll catch up. You guys are the worst, he moaned, arching his back in surrender. Over the sound of more snickering, their sensei asked, amused, Ma, aren't you three a bit young for this discussion? Speaking of which, it's far past your bedtimes. You lot have a big day tomorrow. Yeah, it's probably best if I get back home soon. My mom was usually the one to make sure I was up, back when I was in the academy, and she'll lose her mind if I'm not there, said Sakura. Before either of her teammates could move away, she grabbed their shoulders and held them firmly. I'm so glad you're here with me. Sasuke grunted in agreement and cautiously put his arm around her waist in return. HN, he said. Without even thinking, Naruto gave them both a strong embrace. He smiled broadly and said, with all four of us here, there's no way we could lose. We'll kick Madara and Kaguya's asses all over again if we have to. Together, it'll be easy, you know. With a sigh, Kakashi ruffled the hair of both boys and then gave Sakura a head pat. My adorable little genin, off to conquer the world. Sakura smiled, and the two boys' expressions mirrored hers. But first, she said, let's start with the village. If they were more than a little bloodthirsty, that only made their sensei feel prouder. Shortly after waking up, Sakura heard a knock on her bedroom door. She immediately threw off her blanket and leapt to her feet, kunai already in hand. After that, they quickly became unbalanced, still expecting to be in an 18-year-old's body rather than a 12-year-old's. Her mother's anxious voice called through the door, Sakura? Are you alright, dear? I just heard an awful ruckus. I'm fine, Mom, she moaned as she straightened up. I'm just a bit too excited for today, I guess. After all, it wasn't really a lie, due in part to her so-called diet, but also in part to her nerves causing her stomach to turn over. She had been so excited the last time that she had hardly slept the night before and hadn't eaten breakfast. All because she might end up on a team with Sasuke-kun, which would clearly just indicate that fate had brought them together. However, what would she do if foolish Ino.Pig ended up on his team instead? Sakura let out a sigh, eternally thankful that she had finally moved past that phase of her life and that this time she would only need to pretend for one day. And it was only going to be amusing for her because she knew how much it would annoy her moody teammate. Her mother said, "If you say so," with a suspicious tone. "But you'd better get up, love. You've got barely an hour left to get ready before you've got to leave." "A whole hour? Okay, Mom." Who needed an hour to prepare for spending the entire day in a classroom? For most missions, she didn't even need that much time to prepare. However, she also didn't spend the majority of that hour trying to look nearly flawless. In any case, who needed their hair perfectly combed when they would probably be missing .nin and beating the snot out of bandits soon? She was aware that she had grown significantly since she was this age, but seeing and knowing were two different things. This was further demonstrated when she discovered the red keep-out dress she had worn as a genin when she opened her closet. She was free to criticize Naruto's childhood fashion choices all she wanted, but her own weren't all that much better. Even though the red wasn't an eye-searing orange, it was still bright enough to make it nearly impossible to blend in with any kind of setting. When she grew older, Sakura was able to get away with wearing bright colors because she had the ability to compensate. Furthermore, she no longer went on many missions and instead spent most of her time in the hospital or deep within R&D, working on the prosthetics she had been creating for her teammates. But as she was now, she was weak. Very weak. Her arm was sore and tingly from the single blow she had received hours earlier. She would tolerate it today and then persuade her parents to take her shopping later so she could buy some more suitable clothes. Alternatively, she could convince them to simply give her money until she began using D ranks, at which point she could bring Naruto along. She was fairly certain that if she didn't, he would continue to wear his repulsive jumpsuit for as long as he could get away with it just to watch Sasuke's reactions. As she turned her head back and forth and felt her hair brush against her back, she thought about it. She would need to start putting it up or have it cut soon. She knew that the boys wouldn't let such an advantage slip by during a spar, and her body wasn't currently trained to be very fast. In any case, her head felt heavy like this. She couldn't even recall the last time her hair had been this long. In fact, she most likely cut it that way for the first time during the Chunin exams. She would only ever allow it to grow past her shoulders after that, at which point she would become irritated and cut it off once more. Tomorrow, she would be able to unwind, be more herself, and concentrate on things that were truly important, like taking care of her body. She would put up with the long hair and try her best to act like she had when she was first this age. With hardly a grimace, she started pulling her dress on, keeping that in mind. Naruto had nearly forgotten the severity of the situation. He hadn't truly forgotten, but he hadn't forgotten at all. It was hard to completely recall what it was like to encounter such obvious disgust and hatred after he had at last won the respect and affection of the villagers who had previously rejected him. However, he was no longer the one who had defeated Gaara in the examinations, who had brought Tsunade back and subsequently received Jiraiya's full training, who had assisted in the Kaze's rescue, who had vanquished Nagato and rescued the villagers, who had fought and prevailed against Obito, the Jubi, Madara, and Kagaya, thereby saving the entire elemental nations. Indeed, at that moment, he was nothing more than a demon brat who should never have been allowed to pass the academy. As soon as he saw the Hite.8 tied proudly on his forehead, he could see the anger on their faces. They huddled together, whispering to one another behind hands that did nothing to conceal the sneers beneath, and watching him stroll by through narrowed eyes. He had become accustomed to it long before he had ever made genin, so it hadn't been too hard to ignore the first time. But he was clearly out of practice this time. All he could do was to keep from hunching his shoulders under the weight of their utter hatred and curling in on himself. Even though he was emotionally spent by the time he arrived at the academy, he maintained his composure. Teams would be assigned and distributed in a matter of hours, after which he and his teammates would be alone again and he could unwind. He would be alright. It wasn't like anyone in the classroom except Sakura or Sasuke would be able to tell if his smile was a little too big or a little too crazy, anyway. Speaking of, I got here first, forehead, this seat is mine. You did not, I was 3 whole steps ahead of you, pig. Oh, the sweet sounds of preteen girls' screams. Only one seat was available next to Sasuke, who was sitting in the room's far back corner. He was glaring out the window and making every effort to ignore the girls who were arguing verbally for the available seat. After learning his lesson the last time, Naruto steered into the aisle directly in front of the thrashing girls and scooted as close to the wall as he could. His teammates looked at him, staring at his big smile for a moment, but they didn't say anything because they knew it would be too strange to pass for normal right now. A voice called out to him from next to him, "Hey, Naruto," and he turned to face a child he honestly could hardly recall. Whoever he was, it was clear that he had either dropped out or joined the Genin Corps because he had never passed his Genin test. What the hell are you doing here? This is only for graduates. With a thumb pointing at the scuffed but shiny metal, he demanded, "Can't you see the forehead protector? I am a graduate?" "Yeah, right," snorted a girl from the aisle ahead of him. "Who'd you steal it from, really?" "No one," he shouted, then smiled. "And if I had the skill to steal it from a shinobi, I'd deserve it anyway, don't you think?" The child who had spoken first laughed and then obviously lost interest. "Whatever, dead last," he said. Despite rolling his eyes at them all, Naruto ignored it. He couldn't really blame them for thinking he had stolen it rather than earned it, the way he was now. He had failed the graduation exam, after all. Not that he was totally to blame for that, either. There was never any chance that he would be able to form a normal bunshin, as anyone familiar with chakra and jinchuriki should know. He simply could not control it that much with the amount of chakra he possessed. It was like asking someone to use their bare hands to pick up a single grain of sand in the middle of a desert. His wandering gaze returned to the scene behind him with a howl of rage and a shout of triumph. It was clear that Sakura had employed some devious means to seize the vacant position next to the Uchiha heir, which Ino and the other girls in the class were not pleased about. "You cheater!" Ino angrily exclaimed, her face flushed. Smug in her triumph, Sakura shrugged and said, "What can I say? All's fair in love and war." This seemed to enrage the Yamanaka even more, if anything. Like Sasuke-kun would love someone like Iruka. Sensei's voice interrupted the blonde's scathing retort as he walked into the room, calling out, "All right, everyone take a seat." Sakura, who had developed a slight vindictive streak over the years, merely smirked at her nemesis and future friend, waved her fingers, and scooted over until she and Sasuke were only 5 inches apart. Naruto laughed at the expression of pained resignation on his normally stoic face, and the Uchiha sighed but didn't bother objecting because he knew it would only encourage his pink-haired teammate more. Sakura was obviously enjoying herself while playing her part, and she was giving it her all. "Iruka," Sensei said, "starting today, all of you are real shinobi," as the class finally sat down and turned to face him. By this point, they knew not to push him too hard. Since Naruto had heard the man's words before and knew they weren't particularly significant, at least not until his name was called, he largely ignored what he was saying. Team 7 will be Uzumaki Naruto, Haruno Sakura and Uchiha Sasuke. "Ha! Take that, Ino.pig!" Sakura yelled, leaping to her feet to point at the frowning blonde more precisely. Naruto couldn't help but exclaim, "You better be able to keep up with me and Sakura. Chan, Teme." He turned in his seat and grinned at his sour teammate, snickering when he noticed that expression changed to one of frustration. Sakura snapped back, glaring, "Yeah, right, Naruto. Sasuke. Kun's the greatest shinobi ever. There's no way you'd be able to beat him." Naruto could see her eyes dancing with mischief, likely just as his own did. The two of them probably wouldn't have poked the Uchiha in this manner a year ago. They were just happy to have him back and cautious about doing anything that would compromise that. But now, after days of berating each other and expressing all of their complaints, they had finally come to a place where they didn't mind making light of one another. But if the way he was starting to frown said anything, it didn't mean it didn't still irritate him, and they would most likely pay for it the next time they sparred. But it was well worth it. Before they could proceed, "Iruka!" Sensei screamed, all right, settle down," in a firm voice that threatened to throw chalk at faces if they didn't sit down and stop talking. "We still have team assignments to get to. Save it for later." Sad to have their fun cut short so quickly, they both acquiesced grudgingly, and Sasuke's tense posture eased somewhat in relief. When it came to teasing, he was usually able to give it his best shot. However, he was unable to do so at this time without seriously damaging his reputation. At the age of 12, Uchiha Sasuke avoided making fun of, teasing, or even talking to anyone unless absolutely necessary, especially not in front of a grumpy fangirl and the class dead last. He was unable to wait until today was over. He could tell that Sakura and Naruto were chaffing to let loose with each other just as much as he was, even though they appeared to be enjoying themselves while playing their respective parts. None of them had become accustomed to being anything other than themselves. After lunch came and went, the only people left in the classroom were the genin members of Team 7. Sakura cracked her knuckles in annoyance and growled, "Damn him, just what does he think he's doing?" Sasuke and Naruto, who were seated on either side of her, slowly moved away. He hasn't been late like this since that time he went missing for a week when Tsunade Shisho called him in for a meeting. Well, yeah. That meeting was to inform him that he'd been chosen as her successor, Sasuke grumbled. He couldn't get away with tardiness as easily after that. Absently, Naruto argued, I think it had more to do with Obito and my dad than anything, while focusing on the seal he had been laboriously building for the previous 10 minutes. It was requiring a lot more patience and focus than he would have liked because these hands were no longer accustomed to the smooth, sure movements that were needed. He got a lot of closure during the war. He didn't have to spend so much time at the memorial anymore, and so he wasn't as late to things. He said, and, what, now all of that's worthless? Sakura complained, but scowled thoughtfully. She was still occasionally taken aback by his ability to see people's true nature, particularly those he valued. Nah, this is probably more for old time's sake than anything. Besides, he's got a role to play, too, you know. It's pretty common knowledge that he's always late to everything. If he just suddenly started showing up on time, everyone would get suspicious. Sasuke agreed with a grunt. What are you working on? Naruto told him, well, I can't just put an eraser in the door, in a tone that suggested it should be clear. I did that last time and I don't ever do the same prank twice. So, I've got to spice it up a bit. Sakura knew she was better off not asking because of the fox-like smile that was twisting the blonde's face. She asked, spice it up how, exactly? In a cautious tone, but regrettably, she was far too intrigued to simply ignore it. Naruto said as he hesitated to make public. I thought about doing it literally, at first. But knowing Sensei, he'd ignore it until he died instead of just taking that damn mask off, no matter how hot the spices I used were. So, I decided to take inspiration from my mom instead. The question, your mom, made both teammates tense, not because Naruto was hesitant to discuss his parents. Furthermore, he didn't do it frequently. They were both aware that even though he had accepted their departure, he would always lament the fact that he had never had the opportunity to get to know them well. After all, he could only learn so much from other people's stories, and he had a tendency to jealously hoard any new information he discovered about them. Sakura and Sasuke were fairly certain that they were the only members of their generation to ever hear Naruto discuss his parents in more than a casual way. Rather than elaborate, however, Naruto simply finished off his seal with a flourish and responded with a nebulous, you'll see, before affixing the paper to the chalkboard eraser he had previously used and setting it in the door. More inquisitive than disparaging, Sasuke questioned, do you really think he'll let that happen twice? He let it happen the first time around. No way did he not notice it. The seal isn't obvious and he knows I wouldn't do anything actually dangerous. There's no reason for him not to. And he was shown to be right an hour later. As recklessly as he had the first time, Kakashi slid the door open and stepped through, doing nothing to stop the eraser from falling on his head and causing a huge cloud of chalk dust to fly. Drawling, their sensei asked, really, Naruto? Reusing pranks now? I'm disappointed. With a choked, yeah, Naruto said, you caught me red-handed. Neither Sakura nor he seemed to be able to take it any longer before they both burst out laughing. Sasuke was even grinning more than normal. All of this caused Kakashi to realize that he had overlooked something. What did you do? They went into even more hysterics when they saw their teacher frantically patting his hair, as if to make sure it was all still there. Kakashi pouted for several minutes before they managed to gather themselves. Wiping tears of laughter from his face, Naruto asked in a cunning tone, what can I say? I took a lot of inspiration from the red-hot, blooded habanero this time. At that one, even Sasuke snorted. Kakashi told his pupil drearily, that isn't making me feel any better at all. Your mother was an absolute terror when it came to pranks, most of which ended in grievous bodily harm. Naruto waved him away, saying, it's fine, as only someone who had never been the target of an Uzumaki prank could. Just check a mirror when you get the chance. With a sigh, Kakashi concluded that Naruto still lacked the capacity to deceive his teammates, even about a practical joke. If he said it was okay, then there was nothing dangerous about it. Ma, if you insist. Meet me up on the roof. The copy.nin vanished in a cloud of smoke and a rush of leaves without waiting for an answer. Sasuke remarked, I'd never noticed before just how sloppy he made his shunshuns, as they all slowly left the classroom and headed for the stairs. Sakura shrugged and said, Kakashi, Sensei's always been a bit of a drama queen, why do something seamlessly when you can do it with flair instead? Naruto raised his arms in the air and then crossed them behind his head, saying, plus now someone's gonna have to clean up those leaves, and it's not gonna be him. It's probably gonna be Iruka. Sensei. No wonder he would always glare at Sensei like that. Sakura said drearily, I'm sure the chronically late mission reports didn't help, either. Naturally, when they arrived up there, their sensei was already sitting on the roof railing. "So, how about we introduce ourselves?" he asked, raising an unimpressed eyebrow at them without addressing their speed, or lack thereof, and waiting for them to sit down. After a moment of complete silence during which the three of them gaped, Sasuke demanded, bewildered, "You have got to be kidding me." Now, reprimanded Kakashi, with a warning in his lone eye and joy in his voice. "You three have spent the last few years in the academy together, but I know next to nothing about you." The implication was obvious. They were still acting out their roles because someone was observing. From the perspective of their viewers, Kakashi had never met the three before, and the opposite was true. It was also fairly clear who would be foolish and or courageous enough to spy on copycat Kakashi. The Hokage was the only person the man would allow to get away with it so easily. To be honest, none of the three had thought about the personalized crystal ball the old man had used to monitor the village. When Jiraiya had requested it to aid in his research, it was destroyed, and it had not survived past the first week of Tsunade's rule. Tsunade had responded by hurling her entire desk, along with the ball, at him and then out the window after him. Since it had been a unique creation, it had never been replaced, which, all things considered, was probably for the best. However, it was still in the original owner's possession here and now. Naturally, the third would use it to see how Team 7 is doing. Since Sasuke was on the team, it was crucial that they pass, after all. And despite some of the more foolish choices he had made concerning the Jinchuriki's life, the old man had consistently demonstrated that he had a soft spot for Naruto. When it was obvious that neither boy would, Sakura chirped, "Why don't you go first, sensei?" He slouched and shoved his hands in his pockets as he said, Well, my name is Hitaki Kakashi," in a bored tone. Although he would give anything to have his book out now, he was fairly certain that doing so would only cause Sakura to lose her temper once more, which was something that should be avoided. It was inevitable that Tsunade's former instructor would be the first person in Konoha to recognize her strength technique. "I like Icha. I dislike crazy megalomaniacs. My hobbies include reading and training. My dream for the future is to never become Hokage." Together, the three rolled their eyes. He thought it was an impressive display of teamwork. "Now, from the right, go." "My name is Uzumaki Naruto," the blonde exclaimed, beaming with what seemed like intense enthusiasm. "I like ramen, especially when Iruka sensei buys it for me. I dislike rabbits and the 3 minutes it takes for ramen to cook. My hobbies are training and pranking. My dream for the future is to become Hokage and find true peace." "My name is Uchiha Sasuke," the middle boy said in a fixed tone. "I like tomatoes and dislike being manipulated. My hobby is training. My dream is to find justice for my clan." Her gaze strayed to the boy next to her, and she forced a blush and giggled, only to be encouraged when he sighed and turned to face the sky, seemingly in prayer for patience. "I'm Haruno Sakura. I like," she said. Naruto, on the other hand, hunkered down and tried to hide his annoyance while suppressing his laughter. "I dislike zombies. My hobbies are. And my dream is." As the girl's laughter subsided, Kakashi smiled with amusement, sure that his mask would conceal it. "I see," he said. "Well, now that that's out of the way, we can move on to what'll happen next. Tomorrow, the three of you will be meeting me in Training Ground 3, where I'll be testing you to see if you really have what it takes to be genin." Naturally, none of them were concerned. Even if Kakashi could fail them, there was no way he would. Which, considering how the council was probably breathing down his neck over having him train the final Uchiha, he probably couldn't. They all forced themselves to react beyond the indifferent shrugs they wanted to give, but it wasn't like any of them were supposed to know that. This meant that Sasuke would tense, Naruto would squawk angrily, and Sakura would demand explanations. "But, sensei, we already passed the genin exam." With an eye smile and a perfectly upbeat tone, Kakashi told the three of them, "No, you passed a genin exam, not my genin exam. Each Junin sensei has their own test to administer to their prospective teams. Whether you all pass or not is up to you. Out of the 27 that passed the academy's exam, only 9 are likely to keep their rank and not be sent back to the academy." "What? No way." Naruto cried out in a dramatic manner and leapt to his feet. "We'll show you. We'll definitely beat your test." "We'll see," was Kakashi's evasive response. It was his sincere hope that the Hokage would be content with his spying after this and would not interfere with the test itself. He wanted to know what they could all do now, in these younger bodies, and he knew that they couldn't do it if people were watching them all the time. "Meet me in the morning at 7, Yane." The three genin were left alone on the roof, blinking at the now empty air in front of them, as the man vanished a moment later. After just a few seconds of silence, Naruto's snickering suddenly broke the stillness. I wonder how long it'll take him to realize his hair is dyed bright red. As Kakashi looks objectively at his own reflection, he muses that habits are amusing. Or rather, at the spinning red eye that was staring back. Except for sporadic moments of intense concentration and clarity during difficult struggles, he had been half blind for the great majority of his life. The Sharingan he had been given was concealed under his slanted headband, and he had closed his left eye almost all the time. It simply became instinctive and rote, a part of his everyday routine that he had not even had to consider for almost 20 years. However, those instincts had apparently disappeared after just 1 year of being able to use his left eye without the Sharingan and the associated high risk of chakra exhaustion. The Yamanaka who had been assigned to him following Obito's death and his subsequent personality changes claimed that it only took 20.1 days to break a habit, whereas it could take up to 60.6 days to form a new one. Kakashi sincerely hoped it wouldn't take that long because if it did, the next 2 months would be extremely drawn out. Because even though it wasn't nearly as bad as it had been when he was first this age, the Sharingan is a huge drain on his chakra reserves. And you would think that he would notice it right away because it was such a huge drain. Or that he would notice how suddenly, shockingly, everything became clear. However, no, for the second day in a row, he had completed nearly his whole morning routine before realizing that his left eye was open and uncovered, and only then because of the red flash he had seen in the mirror. They had attempted to make him Hokage, really. He sighed, pulled his Hite.8 down, and left his apartment, engaging his various traps in his mind as he went. He added a few more that he had had later, but those, at the very least, had remained the same. As he assessed his chakra reserves and the weariness already affecting him, he concluded that it was fortunate that his students had also been lowered to their younger skill level because, had they remained in their future bodies, the impending fight most likely would have ended embarrassingly quickly, leaving him with no one to blame. Fortunately, their bodies were as ill-formed as one could get without being a civilian, but their chakra reserves and general knowledge had not changed. Their bodies would never be able to keep up with their brain's speed because their muscle memory would be gone. Kakashi had a clear advantage in that, at least. He's proud to say that unless it was really an all-out fight, he probably wouldn't have had a chance against their future selves. Now against them? If he was being generous, he could get a little sweaty. It would probably take his students a long time to reach their future, glory, and they had a long way to go. Perhaps not as much time as it had taken, but the three of them were still hardly teenagers. Despite their physical deficiencies, they could likely compensate for them in part through skill. Each of them had access to a vast collection of jutsus, but Sasuke's Kekkei Genkai may have given him the most variety, and the Uchiha still had the Mangekyo. Sakura possessed Tsunade's strength technique, medical jutsu, and unbreakable chakra control. Naruto possessed his sealing, his Rasengan, and the ability to control the chakra of the Kyuubi. But as he walked down the street toward Training Ground 3, avoiding collisions with civilians despite having his nose deep in his book, Kakashi thought about that question. Were those items still in the possession of the three of them, at least to the extent that they could be used in a conflict at this moment? Although it was probably worse for him because his had never been intended for him, he was aware from experience just how exhausting the use of Mangekyo could be on the body. Even if he had access to it, Sasuke was unlikely to be able to use it much for the time being, at least not without doing more harm than good. Furthermore, Kakashi had noticed that the Uchiha had lost his Sage given Rinnegan, for which Kakashi was sincerely grateful, as how else could they have explained that? This meant that, given Itachi's current state of life, it was likely safe to assume that Sasuke also no longer possessed an eternal Mangekyo, without which the risk of blindness was extremely real. Therefore, should Sasuke use Mangekyo even if he is free to do so? Furthermore, Naruto's younger body had only ever been exposed to the most basic form of demonic chakra up until this point. That powerful chakra coursing through his system without the opportunity to increase his tolerance was probably going to be, even though the seal was now open and the two were working together, harmful. Since he still knew how to balance the nature chakra within himself, Kakashi believed that the Uzumaki should still be able to access Sage Mode at this time. However, would the fact that he no longer technically had the toad contact have an impact on him? Or did he? After all, summon animals were creatures that only entered this dimension when summoned. Who was to say that a seal that rewound time could have an effect on such a creature? After all, when you really considered it, wasn't time just another dimension? There were a lot of unknown factors to consider, and it was impossible to say for sure until they conducted testing. Sakura would likely be the student who would be most unaffected by their current challenge in terms of skill, but she would also be the one who would endure the most physical hardship. The majority of her abilities were derived from her ability to precisely and completely control her chakra, which she still possessed, as well as the reserves to use it when needed. Her body, however, was worse than out of shape in comparison. The girl had, at least, been on a diet for the past few months, which had left her body weak and essentially half-starved. Given that it had likely taken everything she had not to pass out from the stress of the practice, it was understandable why she had started out so poorly at taijutsu. Additionally, employing the legendary sucker's strength technique would likely end up costing her more in the long run until she gained a respectable amount of muscle. She could probably heal the worst of the consequences, which is probably the only reason she'd gotten away with it when they'd first arrived. Although he was out of practice, Kakashi still had the reflexes of a Junin, his Sharingan and Mangekyo, and the knowledge and chakra reserves to use both. He could also acknowledge that he needed some training to regain the strength and skill that had diminished in this body since his retirement from Anbu. Overall, he would probably return to his previous level, if not surpass it, in a matter of months. However, it would probably take years for his students' bodies to fully recover. At least they had that time, he thought to himself as he glanced up at the sky, observing that 3 hours had passed since he had instructed his students to meet and that he should likely appear soon, lest they decide their frustration was sufficient to work together on a suitable retaliation. Kakashi's apartment had never been the same since that last time, and Tsunade had been unable to look him in the eye for months afterward without bursting into gleeful snickering. And Kakashi had to fight the urge to shiver at the mere thought. Naruto was unquestionably an Uzumaki, through and through, something that was all too obvious when it came to his more dangerous pranks. When you combine his inventiveness with Sasuke's aggressive need to get even and Sakura's frankly terrifying level of unsympathetic vindictiveness, and it was a surefire recipe for total disaster. To determine which skills they could still rely on and which would need to be trained or put on hold until their bodies could handle the strain of them, they would use today. After that, they could begin planning their next course of action. The catastrophe that was the Chunin exams and everything that had come after it was still a few months away. Additionally, they would ideally have a few years before Akatsuki started to really make their move. Hopefully, there will be enough time to develop plans and backup plans and to work on the necessary tasks to ensure that they can actually execute them. Yes, Kakashi concluded, that was their plan. Speculation would only take them so far until they were aware of their present boundaries. Then, with a guileless smile and a ridiculous excuse already on his lips, he finally gave in and shunshine to his destination, arriving in his typical flurry of leaves before pausing. Because the 3 genin in front of him didn't resemble the ones he had supposedly met the day before at all. The 3 of them had exchanged yesterday's clothes for far more sensible ones. The majority of their clothing was now gray and black, but Sakura and Naruto had not entirely abandoned their signature hues. Sasuke had obviously chosen to dress like the Anbu, minus the white body armor, which, to be honest, looked a little silly on his 12-year-old body. However, Kakashi couldn't really judge him because it had taken him months to adjust to the looser fitting clothing that most shinobi typically wore. It seems that Sakura even made the time to go to a salon, where her bubblegum pink hair was cut into a bob that framed her face. Her bangs were now styled to fall over her forehead, just like they would in the future. He probably would have been grudgingly impressed if this had actually been his second encounter with them. Most didn't understand that they truly lacked the skills required to have the freedom to dress as conspicuously as they desired until they got to Chunin. Those who attained that rank were frequently obliged to wear the vest in part because they were now in a higher rank and were performing missions that were far riskier than those they had previously performed. For most, it was a death sentence to stand out when they lacked the authority to support it. As it was, he was just frustrated, particularly when he concentrated on their actions rather than their appearance, because all 3 of them were sitting quietly next to each other, clearly enjoying each other's company. Sakura was aimlessly poring over a huge medical text. Sasuke was examining his weapons, and Naruto was scrawling frantically in a notebook. His expression of intense focus was so similar to Minato Sensei's that it nearly made Kakashi's heart hurt. To be honest, he had no idea what he had been anticipating. They had never been subtle in the slightest. Dryly, he told them, "You're very lucky the Sandame was content to wait for my verdict instead of spying in." They were rude because none of them bothered to look up or even acknowledge his presence. Or else the sight of you 3 now would be more than a little suspicious. Sakura shrugged and looked up at him at last. "We could have just said that we'd taken your threat yesterday seriously," she said. Her displeasure with his tardiness was evident from her expression. "None of us want to be sent back to the academy. Now, we can just say that you told us to take it seriously. We're the first team you've ever passed. Nobody knows just how you'd act as a teacher to Genin. The only prior experience you have is with Anbu, right? She had a point, and he reluctantly acknowledged it, and Naruto's new fervor for note-taking? With her head tilted to the side in apparent ignorance, she asked innocently, I just happened to mention that I'd seen the name Uzumaki in a history book and that they'd apparently been seal masters. No one can blame him for wanting to be closer to his family in any way he can, right? Kakashi chose to concede this case. Questions would still probably arise, particularly from the Sandaime and Iruka, but they probably wouldn't be a major issue. Furthermore, that wasn't really what they were meant to be concentrating on right now. All right, you three, Kakashi said with a gentle handshake, grabbing their attention right away. In a matter of seconds, they had arranged their belongings and positioned themselves in front of him, prepared to follow their team captain's instructions. To be honest, their youthful appearance made the change in them much more noticeable. Today, we're gonna test out our limits and find where they are. We need to know what we can do and, more importantly, what we can't. You're going to come at me with all you've got. You already know your objective. With tender affection, he patted the two bells attached to his belt loop and observed his pupils nodding, their expressions resolute. Working independently and unaware of the actual nature of the test, they had failed to obtain even one the first time. He had been a little irritated at the time, despite his sincere praise for Naruto and Sakura's cunning and dishonest methods of getting one over on him the second time. Even if they had chosen to use the same strategy twice, which was highly unlikely, there would be no chance of ruining the ending of one of his priceless books because all three of them were together and working as a true team this time. What they came up with this time would be interesting to see. Well? He inquired, grinning broadly at them. Get to it? He was standing by himself in the clearing in a matter of seconds. After running for a few long moments, Naruto halted and waited while crouching soundlessly on the ground approximately 1.5 miles downwind of the clearing where their sensei was still present. Although Sasuke may have quicker reflexes at the moment, the Uchiha had never been able to outpace him in terms of speed. Actually, very few people could in the future, but for the time being, he was at least confident that he had defeated every rookie 9. However, he didn't have to wait long for Sasuke to land soundlessly beside him. Sakura was still a ways away and was probably extremely angry despite her obvious physical weakness, so they exchanged a pitying glance before focusing their attention and senses on their surroundings. They had all learned the hard way that just because it seemed like Kakashi Sensei was still in the clearing, it didn't mean he was. Actually, they wouldn't have dared to pause in one spot for this long, much less long enough to devise a plan, if they hadn't already known exactly what their teacher was hoping to learn from this particular test. However, he wasn't assessing their situational awareness, flexibility in making plans, or ability to handle unforeseen circumstances. He wasn't worried about whether they could function as a cohesive unit even in the absence of communication opportunities. The main worry of the day was what they would be able to do now, physically, given how weak they were. To be honest, Naruto had to grimace. He had trained at this age. It wasn't that he hadn't, but he hadn't known how to do it properly. In addition to being the Jinchuriki to the beast that had destroyed their village, massacred their comrades, and killed their Hokage, he had been known to be disliked by the majority of his academy teachers. However, he was unaware at the time that some of them had been actively working against him. It wasn't anything significant or immediately apparent, or else he knew that even before he had become close to Naruto, Iruka Sensei would never have allowed it to go unnoticed. A question was accidentally overlooked there, and a taijutsu kata was incorrectly corrected here, but those minor details soon added up over years. Furthermore, he didn't have anyone to turn to or ask for assistance when he was younger. While other children could ask their parents, siblings, or friends for homework assistance, Naruto had no such choice. He had simply given up trying to get help from anyone by the time Iruka Sensei became his teacher because it was obvious that it didn't work, and he hadn't even considered trying again. Hell, it wasn't until he went on his training trip with Ero Sennin and the man tried to enlist him to help edit his manuscripts that he truly realized how poor his writing and reading comprehension had been. But before being admitted to the academy, he had no one to teach him those things, and all the other children had already mastered them. The point was that Naruto had no base at this age. He lacked the muscle memory and strength to truly support his future style, and his taijutsu had been more brawl than anything else. Although he was fairly knowledgeable about ninjutsu, his younger hands were unable to keep up, which caused his seals to be awkward and slow. No matter how much speed and stamina he still had, his brain was now moving at a speed that his body could never hope to match. To make matters worse, Kurama had already forewarned him strongly not to attempt to use any of his tailed beast chakra. It would not only be felt all over the village and cause panic, but it was also very likely to destroy him. Evidently, it was much worse than it had been before the seal had been broken, as his body had never before had to deal with more than very small amounts of the demonic chakra. That basically left Naruto with Sage Mode, which he knew he could still use because of the Sage, but which would probably not be very useful in the long run. Yes, it would make him stronger, faster, and more resilient, but with his body in this state, it was unlikely to have a significant impact. Time travel was not a good idea for many reasons. Certainly near the top of the list was being trapped in his younger, frailer body. He realized he wasn't the only one who thought so when he looked back and saw the unsightly frown on Sasuke's face. Nevertheless, Naruto, as usual, was compelled to try to focus his thoughts on the good. There was little use in pouting over it. No amount of complaining would change what had already been done. Rather, he would simply need to put in twice as much work, or, if necessary, 3 times as much. Despite all the odds being against him, he had overcome them the last time, and this time he had a significant advantage and others he could completely rely on. They had more than nothing to begin with. They had each other, they were Team 7, and they would always be Team 7. That was sufficient. That was more than sufficient until they regained their individual strength. Sakura's movements were jerky and lacked the finesse they usually possessed as she crashed through the underbrush at that precise moment, her bangs sticking to the perspiration on her face and her chest twitching as she struggled to control her breathing. Her expression was almost apocalyptic and typically indicated that someone was going to be punched through a wall with enough force to bring down the entire structure. And that wasn't just an exaggeration either. He was fairly certain that one guy had ended up with nearly all of his bones broken, but even Naruto found it difficult to feel sorry for him when it had been because he had tried to drug Sakura's drink in a kiri bar at the height of his foolishness. What could have turned into a global incident instead ended with Terumi Mei giving her a high five, which had been horrifying to watch. Fortunately, neither of them appeared to be the target of that wrath at the moment, and Naruto merely hoped that would remain the case. Sakura growled, "I hate this," and strode forward to stand beside them, so furious that she didn't care if her actions were a neon sign announcing their location. It seemed that their teacher was happy to let them approach him for once, even though normally such an event would cause Kakashi to descend upon them like a wraith, and Naruto and Sasuke were both tense in anticipation of it. Kakashi. Sensei wasn't even out of sight and I was already tired. What in the hell was I thinking at this age? I have no stamina at all. Whatever muscle I built up in the academy has been burned away, likely to make up for the fact that I've clearly been starving myself, and this isn't a new development. This has to have been going on for months. How could our teachers see prospective Kunoichi doing this and not set us straight immediately? How could they let anyone graduate in this condition? As she raged, Naruto kept silent, not so much because he was afraid of drawing her attention to himself as because he was at a loss for words that would not only infuriate her, because there was really nothing to justify. With the exception of a small minority, most of the teachers present had not engaged in combat in years. And those few made a sincere effort, but they were unable to cover all the bases and be everywhere at once. She held her head high as they turned to look at her, Sasuke in betrayed disbelief and him in hopeful excitement. "After this, we're going out for ramen for lunch," she said. "It'll replace the sodium we lose, and I need the carbohydrates. And for dinner, we'll go to Yakiniku-Q tomorrow. After training and missions, we'll go shopping to stock up on food. Training won't do us any good if we're not eating right." To be certain, Naruto inquired, "But, ramen for lunch?" Sakura said, "Ramen for lunch," and nodded, "And Kakashi's paying." A smile split Naruto's face. The last shopping trip had been agonizing enough, and he had no desire to go shopping again. It had taken him a long time to find something he was happy enough to wear, even though he had been hanged the entire time and had avoided dealing with irate civilians and absurdly unfair prices. Sticking to darker hues, as he had come to do in the future, he discovered a dark gray sleeveless shirt with a large hood that he could use to conceal his bright blonde hair and a tall neck that he could duck his face into to conceal the marks on his cheeks. He had taken the time the previous evening to meticulously stitch a dark blue Uzumaki spiral into the back, and the lining had a dark orange edge that was only visible in the light. To fit in with the majority, he had considered making it red or orange, but he had ultimately decided against it. That kind of thing would be a huge target and would only serve to undermine everything else he has tried. Sakura had adopted his style, focusing on darker clothing rather than the vivid pinks and reds she had always loved. The top she had chosen was similar to what she had worn prior to their return, albeit with shorter tails and a slightly more modest design. It was medium gray with a dark red lining, and she had embroidered her clan's emblem on the sleeves before this morning. In addition to adding a belt with pockets on either side to store the medications and poisons she would be stockpiling, She had selected a pair of black shorts to wear underneath, reaching down to her knees. Even in the best of circumstances, Sasuke was a dull stick in the mud, so he had taken the easy route and chosen to resemble the Anbu uniform he had worn almost constantly since joining their ranks as much as possible. Although it was likely a very reluctant concession, it appears that he had made the decision to include the Uchiha fan on the back of it. At this age, Sasuke had been very proud of his clan, and after all he had learned about them, that pride had diminished, though it hadn't entirely disappeared. And the ability to simply was one of the things he had loved most about Anbu. Even as he rose through the ranks, he faded into the background, becoming just another one of many. That was not an option for him here and now. Nevertheless, they had all changed and were happy with their accomplishments when they returned from the trip. However, that didn't mean Naruto wanted to go through it again. However, Sakura was glaring at them, her eyes blazing with barely suppressed anger, and she was simply daring them to argue with her so she could vent all of her bottled up annoyance on them. Neither of them was foolish enough to respond to that. Furthermore, Naruto wasn't ashamed to fall for it outright because ramen was a pretty good motivator to get him to agree to something he otherwise would have flatly refused. Sasuke sighed and gave in with ill grace after glancing between them and estimating his chances of them changing their minds. Whatever, he complained. We have to get through this first. Plan. Sakura said, I'll have to be relegated to support, following a pause. Her expression made it clear to Naruto that she detested having to make the admission. I can use the strength technique once, maybe twice before the damage will be too much to heal quickly. I can still use jutsu and I can still heal you if I need to, but I won't be able to for long. Having enough chakra and control won't do me a lot of good if my body gives out. And we can't trap the area if Kakashi Sensei isn't moving, Naruto muttered, his hand raised to his chin in contemplation. Jutsu and Sage Mode are all I've got to work with. Kurama said I'm not allowed to use his chakra for a while, not until my body has more of a resistance to it. Sasuke? Uchiha gave a grimace. I'm pretty sure I still have my Mangekyo, but it's probably just that. Not the eternal Mangekyo. So, I don't know how using it will go. Beyond that, I have jutsu. My taijutsu was almost chunin level at this point, but that's not really saying much. They all exchanged a dejected glance. Even though they had known it since they became aware that they were in their pre-genin bodies, hearing it expressed in such a way, they all fell well short of their own expectations. Whipping their bodies into any shape would require an enormous amount of effort. Well, chirped Naruto, attempting to sound as upbeat as he could, we gotta start somewhere, yeah? Might as well be now, TT Ibeo. Sakura and Sasuke exchanged a look that was both incredibly fond and frustrated, then nodded, their eyes hardening with resolve. No Team 7 member had ever been adept at turning down a challenge, and this one was no exception. Right. Let's do this. Ultimately, they both concluded that simplicity was the best course of action. Their teacher already knew they could pull that off if it was necessary, and that wasn't the purpose of this test in the first place, so there was no need for some complicated plot. They needed to be both ostentatious and cunning, which was actually quite feasible with Naruto on the team. Thus, after arguing for a few minutes, they returned to the clearing without trying to conceal their approach. They were awkward bodies, and Kakashi was a Junin. They probably couldn't sneak up on him, even if they tried. Not until he was sufficiently distracted, anyway. Sakura took the initiative, jumping from a tree branch and using all of her chakra, enhanced strength to bring her fist down to the ground. It instantly gave way outward and crumbled under the pressure. After everything had calmed down, Kakashi, who had been accustomed to such maneuvers for a long time, just used the momentum to jump and avoid it, landing again gracefully on 2 feet. Then, with his eyes clearly showing that he was using Sage Mode, Naruto bore down on him with a Rasengan, which he had to instantly avoid. And once more as Sasuke used a Phoenix Flower Jutsu to barrage him. And once more as Sakura threw a few shuriken at him. Before long, all 3 of them were pursuing him, one after the other, doing everything they could to keep him from taking a break. Even when they were older, their jutsu repertoire was truly impressive, but now it was probably going to draw a lot of attention. 3 people who appeared to be pre-genin were thrown out as if they were insignificant, even though not even the most high chunin knew that many. Even Sakura, though she stayed closer to the periphery and used carefully timed kunia and shuriken to divert his attention more than jutsu, probably to conserve her energy for when she could deliver another powerful blow. It was proceeding roughly as Kakashi had anticipated. In terms of chakra application and control, they were far superior to their peers, and Sasuke and Naruto were probably physically superior as well. However, he could see that they were already faltering and exhausted. Naruto was the only one still alive, but he had always been a stamina and chakra nerd, and Sage Mode had only strengthened his resilience. Nevertheless, they all possessed only the bodies of children who were hardly trained. They wouldn't be around for long. Sasuke and Sakura were able to take a step back and catch their breath when the clearing was suddenly covered in blood. Even though he sliced through the crowd like butter, Kakashi approved of the strategy, but it would never have succeeded if he had been a real enemy. Would have probably backfired, highlighting rather than minimizing weakness. He briefly considered approaching his other two pupils to make a point, but he ultimately chose not to. They were likely as familiar with it as he was. The only warning he received before a futon. Great breakthrough was aimed at him, and he felt a slight shift in the air behind him as he dispelled one of the final groups of clones, their eyes having returned to Naruto's typical bright blue. Sasuke had seized the opportunity to add a grand fireball not even a second later. Normally, that attack would have been pretty pointless because it was slow and unwieldy, but when combined with the power of a wind jutsu and supported by both boys' chakra, it transformed the clearing into a miniature fire that even Kakashi barely managed to escape. A hand was shooting up from the ground towards him at lightning speed, focusing on the bells at his hip, just as his feet landed on a clear chunk of uprooted earth. If Kakashi had been taking things more seriously, or if this had been a legitimate mission, he could have avoided this situation once more. The faint aftershocks from the Raiden jutsus he had used earlier, however, were causing Sasuke to pant and grimace, and he could see that his limbs were shaking. Below him, Sakura was gasping for air and obviously struggling to muster the strength to break free from the Doden jutsu she was employing. If Naruto had left another clone somewhere to collect more nature chakra, he could probably continue, but he would most likely be doing so by himself until his teammates recovered their energy. Kakashi chose to give them this victory in spite of that. Until they developed greater endurance, it would most likely be the final one for some time. Additionally, the three were probably already feeling very disappointed and frustrated with their performance. There was no need to add insult to injury by denying them this one item. He did not resist when Sakura pulled the bells away after letting her hand snag on them. He could see the faint pride on her face, but he could also see the disgust. None of them, competitive as they were, like being handicapped. Given her current condition, she most likely hadn't anticipated performing as well as she had. Naruto exclaimed, "All right," but not quite as loudly as he might have if it had been a real win. Beside him, Sasuke merely grunted. "Nicely done," exclaimed Kakashi, bending down to help Sakura out of the dirt she was still fairly covered in. From where it still hovered on the edge of the clearing, the one he had assumed to be Sakura, now exposed as a hanged clone, gave him a cheeky salute before vanishing. It was a good plan, to distract a stronger opponent with big attacks while your teammate sneaks up on them. Granted, it wouldn't have worked if Sakura didn't have such precise control over her chakra. The fact that Naruto was practically leaking the stuff helped to mask her approach, as well. And neither of you made it obvious that you were trying to herd me into position, either. Sakura winced and said, "I had to break the ground first," while trying to get herself together. He praised her resolve, but it was a pointless attempt. "I didn't have the strength to move through solid earth, even if I had enough chakra to perform the Doden technique." Naruto let out a sigh. "My clones barely lasted a second. I can coordinate with them way better now, but without good taijutsu to back them up, they're pretty much worthless in a fight, besides being distractions." With a frown, Sasuke gazed down at his twitching fingers, as though they had betrayed him. "I couldn't put a lot of power into my Raiden jutsus. I can barely feel my arms at all. This body is so weak." As the Uchiha spat the final word like a curse, silence fell upon them, since they were all aware that he was correct. Kakashi finally said, "We have a lot of work to do," after glancing at each of them. His pupils looked at him gravely. "Obviously, our first priority is going to be working you three into shape. By the time we meet up tomorrow, I'll have your training planned out, because you're all at different levels right now. It's going to be the training from hell. What guy puts his team through will look like a dream in comparison." They didn't argue, and they didn't even appear to want to. "Instead," said Sakura, "I can help by healing us at the end of every day, replacing and repairing our muscle fibers then instead of waiting a few days for it to really kick in. I can't do it for long. It wouldn't be very healthy for our bodies if I did. I can probably do it for a month at a time, while taking a month in between to let it build naturally. Though, I'd say I shouldn't do it for more than 3 or 4 months overall." Everyone thought about that for a moment. Naturally, Kakashi was aware of the best ways to train for muscle growth, but he was unaware of the medical nuances. Furthermore, he had undoubtedly never heard of anything similar. However, considering that Sakura was the one who suggested it, perhaps that wasn't all that shocking. Naruto interrupted, looking distractedly inward. Kurama says he can do that for me, he said. He says it'll be a good way to help me get stronger quicker while also introducing his chakra to my body in small doses. It'll take a while to build up enough immunity to even try for a single tail without really messing myself up, apparently. He wants to take any chance he can get to combine our chakra. Sasuke admitted, his face contorted into a grimace. It worked well for Lee. We can also add weights, he suggested. Yeah, bushy brows has always been super fast, even when we first met him. He totally kicked Tomi's ass without even breaking a sweat. With a menacing smirk, Naruto skillfully swerved away from Sasuke's growling fist. Sakura strode forward and positioned herself firmly between them. Her face said daring them to try to move her, before either of them could attack again or worse, turn into untrained puppies rolling around in the dirt. Usually, for our age group, weights aren't the best idea, actually. They can seriously hinder our growth and even be counterproductive. But if we're also reinforcing ourselves with chakra while we wear them, the damage should be negligible. And it'll help our bodies build up more of a tolerance to using jutsu, too. We have the chakra and control, right now, and the knowledge of how to use it. But beyond the Academy 3 and Sasuke's Grand Fireball, our bodies haven't had to use a lot of chakra. That's why we tired out so much quicker. Our coils are being stretched further than they ever have before. Since it was obvious that the fight had hardly affected his ability to use chakra, Naruto remained silent in response. His coils were nearly always stretched wide because he still had Uzumaki reserves. Even if he wasn't used to the Kyuubi's chakra, he had absolutely no idea how his teammates must be feeling. All right, said Kakashi, we'll start with that. You can train however you'd like tonight, just don't overdo it. You'll need your energy tomorrow. We'll meet at the gate bright and early to do warm-up laps around the village. Then, we'll work on taijutsu until about noon. Break for lunch and then D-ranks until dinner. Then more laps and taijutsu before we head home for the night. Every day we'll start with laps. I might adjust our schedules day to day, but until you've gotten to a point that I'm happy with, all of our effort is going to be strictly physical conditioning. If you want to train something else, do it on your own time, but don't let it affect what you do with us. Got it? Each of them gave a nod. Naturally, each of them had specific things they wanted to improve on, but they could see why this should be their top priority. At least Naruto was aware that his clones would be of no assistance in getting in shape, so he could assign them to the task of transcribing his Fuinjutsu notebooks. After all, their knowledge and chakra could be reabsorbed more easily than any muscle they acquired. Furthermore, those notebooks were crucial, and even though it could occasionally be tiresome, it was also kind of enjoyable because he was remembering things he had missed the first time, or, more frequently, was becoming more and more inspired. He had already destroyed 2 notebooks, one containing new theories and the other old notes. He had truly treasured the box of battered notebooks he had received after the war, once his parentage had been recognized. Each one was filled with his parents' ideas, sometimes in meticulous, looping script and other times in a hasty, nearly frantic scrawl, as if the words would be lost forever if they weren't put down on paper quickly enough. Naruto felt more connected to them than ever before, and as a result, he carried at least one of them with him everywhere. He read them repeatedly, almost compulsively, until he had them all essentially committed to memory, to the extent that people started making fun of him by comparing him to Kakashi sensei. Naturally, they were packed with sophisticated theories, penned by 2 of Konoha's best Fuinjutsu practitioners at the time, one of whom was an Uzumaki who had lived in Uzushio for her early years. He wanted to know exactly what his mother and father were saying, so it had been frustrating that memorizing them hadn't made any sense to him. Which had prompted him to beg for training from Tsunade, Kakashi, and anybody else who even remotely cared about the art. Hero of the Fourth War as he was, most had been more than happy to, and although that had caused him some discomfort, he had not let that stop him from accepting all the assistance available to him. At the moment, those notebooks were out of his reach, locked away in a vault in the Hokage Tower along with the rest of his parents' possessions. Even though he had a tenuous relationship with his parents, he missed them like an ache. It wasn't exactly the same as copying what had been written inside onto new notebooks, but it was at least something. Furthermore, these hands were truly unaccustomed to the fluid, sweeping movements required to create seals. He hoped his clones would be able to cover it, as it was something he really wanted to fix. If they were going to be training as hard as he hoped they would, he seriously doubted he'd have the energy to do it himself for a while. The remainder of the afternoon is yours, as I have a meeting with the Hokage. Anyway, Kakashi grinned down at them, hands in his pockets, and slouching again. You guys pass, obviously. We won't be able to start taking missions until tomorrow, after the paperwork is filed to declare us a team. Before he could shun away, all three of them sprang forward and grabbed a firm grip on his arms. He paused to blink in confusion down at their stern, glaring little faces. Did I forget something? Even though Kakashi didn't try to break free, Naruto told him solemnly, "First, we're getting ramen." What most people in the village thought of him had never really mattered to Sasuke. He had been more worried about his father's and his family's opinions when he was younger. Others had later only served as a bothersome diversion, diverting his focus with meaningless gestures of sympathy and hollow flattery. Since his clan had suffered such a terrible loss, he hadn't wanted their excuses. It wasn't my intention for them to swoon over him. Had not desired their encouragement or praise. Of course he was better, smarter, and stronger because he was a Uchiha. Since he had a clear objective and a relentless will to achieve it, he was obviously far superior to his classmates, who spent their days sleeping, playing tricks, or gossiping. He hated it and mostly ignored it because it was of no use to him. Eyes had followed him everywhere after that night, always full of sympathy for his situation or envy and admiration for his ancestry. But he was not unaware. He had always seen Naruto's eyes, just as he had felt them on him. Because of how everything seemed to be between them, it was both so similar and so different. Naruto received glares and harsh, unforgiving faces in place of the cheerful smiles and sorrowful eyes that welcomed him. When he asked for anything, practically everyone wanted to please him, but Naruto was ignored, shunned, and driven away. To the extent that the majority of their classmates had disregarded the treatment without giving it any thought, the blonde had also consistently ignored it, wearing big smiles and shouting and laughing without shame. Since Naruto was a prankster and constantly misbehaving, it was understandable why he was despised by everyone. Furthermore, Naruto had always been obnoxious if it had truly been going on all along, before they had ever joined the academy and before he had ever pulled a practical joke on anyone. No one in their age group had ever bothered to look past the fact that it was wrong, so wrong. Had dismissed his smile after observing it in the face of others' disdain. Even after they were informed of Naruto's Jinchuriki status, he didn't believe that most had figured it out. To be honest, Sasuke wouldn't be shocked if they hadn't. Even before they were sent back, their classmates hadn't won Sasuke's respect, despite his teammates' frustrated attempts to make friends with him. Each of them had developed into a formidable shinobi in their own right. Shikamaru was the only one who had even approached. However, at this age, hadn't he also written it off? Even as he had noticed it, he chose to ignore it, telling himself that it didn't matter. It was as pointless as everything else because it had nothing to do with him, wouldn't strengthen him, and wouldn't bring him any closer to getting his retribution. But now he was allowing himself to see it. The blonde walking beside him was the target of all the hate, dislike, irritation, contempt, and 100 other unpleasant emotions that he was experiencing. The blonde, who was obviously struggling to maintain his composure under its weight. Sasuke had to fight the urge to snarl as he watched out of the corner of his eye as Naruto's smile grew wider and wider until it almost seemed manic. These people didn't even know what they were doing at the moment. He had witnessed Naruto proudly and resolutely face numerous forces, including Kagaya and Orochimaru, without showing any signs of fear. Even though his spine was kept erect, he appeared smaller than Sasuke had ever seen him after only a few minutes of strolling down the main road of Konoha, the place that was meant to be his home. One by one, the stares flinched away from Sasuke, and he couldn't help but feel a little satisfied when he turned to glare back at them. He would be damned if he allowed it to continue this time, even though he had ignored it the last time and had done nothing to assist his teammate or stop them. After everything he had done and what he had already planned to do at this age, he was the only one who deserved those looks. They owed Naruto their loyalty, respect, and admiration. He was never deserving of their hatred. Never again would Sasuke allow himself to be consciously unaware of that. It was only when he heard Kakashi clear his throat pointedly behind them that he realized the street was becoming more and more silent, filled with a deep sense of unease, and that he had started to leak a good amount of killing intent to go along with his heated glare. He hadn't been the only one, either, judging by the way Sakura twitched guiltily from Naruto's other side. "Ma, that's not very fair, picking on defenseless civilians like that," their teacher said nonchalantly, as if he hadn't even looked up from his book. But he was secretly giving warning looks of his own, so it was obvious that his heart wasn't in the reprimand. Only sneering and complaining, Sasuke said, "They're lucky that's all they're getting." But Naruto's shoulders had already relaxed considerably, and he was laughing, a real laugh. "It'll be fine," he said with a cheerful cheer. "Besides, we're here." The blonde hurried forward in excitement without saying another word and wasted no time in dragging himself up onto a stool. To the chef's pleased glee, He had already placed an order and was prattling away by the time the others had caught up. And then Sasuke. Teme sent a big fireball and Sakura. Chan was like pow. Right up out of the ground and got the bells. It was so cool, Oja-san. And we all passed and we're on Team 7 now. With utter sincerity, the chef and his daughter exclaimed, "Congratulations." Sasuke felt his annoyance subside, at least temporarily. He knew the blonde loved them both because he had never witnessed either of them treat Naruto cruelly. In that case, first bowl is on the house for all of you. Really? Naruto was practically bouncing with excitement, as though the blonde's presence didn't make the offer of free ramen a commonplace occurrence. Thanks. Kakashi took the seat in the far corner, slouching as he looked dejectedly into the depths of his wallet. Sakura and Sasuke sat on either side of him, scooting away just far enough that they wouldn't be in danger of flailing limbs. When Naruto got into his story reenactments, that was a very real danger. Sasuke felt no pity whatsoever for the man. Aside from the monthly stipends he and Naruto received as orphans and the inheritances that Sasuke had never touched, he was the only one with actual money at the moment. He was the only one who could actually treat them right now, and he could play the helpless victim all he wanted, but his mission history would not allow him to be hurt for money. Taking them out to lunch was the least he could do as their instructor. In all honesty, the least expensive choice they had was ramen. Later, when Sakura somehow forced him to pay for dinner as well, he should stop whining. After ordering their usual items from the Ichiraku menu, which they had been accustomed to for a long time, Sakura produced her, quite frightening, medical text, and Naruto produced his Fuinjutsu notes. Neither of them noticed Kakashi's disapproving gaze and frustrated sigh. What did he really expect? Just because it wasn't what their academy selves would do, none of them worked on what they liked. Sasuke could easily get away with it. The village considered him a prodigy, and no one would be surprised if he developed quickly under the guidance of a Junin, particularly one of Kakashi's level. Sakura had always been book smart and had a knack for controlling chakras, so she could probably get away with it most of the time as well. Actually, Naruto was the only one who would draw attention and raise suspicions. Being the dead last, he had been genuinely awful the previous time around and didn't even know how to play to his own advantages. However, he had also developed quickly, even though Sasuke had still neglected him. As the only unwounded party, Sasuke should really let it go, but if there was one thing the Uchiha were very good at, it was holding grudges, no matter how hard he tried not to. In spite of the council breathing down his neck, their supposed similarities, and Sasuke's supposed genius, he never should have given one student more importance than another. Naruto and Sakura had long forgiven him for it. Contrary to popular belief, Naruto was capable of lying. Naruto was a master of deception. Given his upbringing, he would have to be, and even after he had become the hero of the elemental nation, he had not forgotten how to use a smile as a shield, concealing a lot of things behind it while acting foolish. On the other hand, he could lie with icy certainty, his serious, straight face making his words unmistakable. Sasuke had repeatedly witnessed it in the face of random bystanders and during missions. The main idea was that Naruto, unlike Iruka, Tsunade, or Shikamaru, could not lie to people who knew him well in the future. As much as the Sandaime and Iruka loved Naruto during this period, they no longer knew him, so only Team 7 would be able to recognize the tells. Hadn't had enough time with the younger Naruto to make such a claim, and hadn't even really known him. When they inquired about Naruto's new attire, hobbies, and abilities, he would smile while lying through his teeth. He would feel terrible about it and would tell half-truths to make himself feel better, but he would do it with ease and no one would question him because no one would ever expect him to lie to anyone, much less the people he cared about the most. Kakashi could unwind. He ought to have realized by now that, as long as Uzumaki Naruto was present, everything would work out in the end, even in the worst of circumstances. Sasuke had finally come to terms with the fact that he might have had to do it the hard way. He was never going to abandon that faith again. Team 7. Pass. His declaration was met with complete silence, and Kakashi bravely resisted the temptation to drop a senbon just to see how loudly it would reverberate. Rather, he raised his gaze from the pages before him to the disbelieving looks they were giving him. Was that really that surprising? He had never taken a team before, to be sure, but he had never been given a team like this either. Each had potential even in their early, undeveloped, and untrained states. Regardless of what the council desired, he would never have passed them if they hadn't. In an attempt to bring the issue back into focus, the Hokage cleared his throat. Right, Team 8? As usual, there were more failures than passes on the list. Out of the more than 30 applicants in the class, only 9 would be pursuing careers. Some would return to the academy, Some would train as medics at the hospital, and some would be lost in the Genin Corps for all time. Others would completely give up on their dreams of becoming shinobi, and focus on some sort of civilian work instead. It was the way things were, and had been for some time, but Kakashi couldn't help but gaze around at everyone who had died in his generation and the generation that followed. I couldn't help but wonder what had caused the graduating team's average to drop so precipitously. It was no longer wartime, as it had been for them as kids, but surely that shouldn't have mattered so much. Perhaps he could persuade Sakura or Naruto to question Iruka about it. He was aware that Naruto would continue to work for peace in any way he could, and that their objective was to prevent things from getting as bad as they had previously, hopefully preventing the Fourth War from becoming a problem. However, there would always be missions and people in need of a shinobi to protect them, and it would be foolish to not train genin hopefuls to the best of their abilities. Kakashi fought the urge to rub his temples and sigh, as he had always witnessed Tsunade do when she was particularly irritated. Even though he had never been given the title, it seemed that he had been infected with a Hokage's way of thinking after all. Kakashi, a word. He looked up and shrugged, utterly unapologetic for his blatant disregard for the Sandame's amused stare. After all, he already knew who had died, and even if he hadn't, he wouldn't have cared. He would eventually learn about them if the new genin had been anything to boast about. He had previously learned about them for the first time during the nominations for the Chunin exam. That demonstrated their abilities sufficiently at this point. As the final members of his group slipped out of the room, shutting the door behind them, Kakashi bowed his head and said, "Hokage Sama," before waiting. The Sandame started, "Your team," as Kakashi had anticipated, they passed on their own merits? As though the elderly gentleman had anticipated anything less. Of course, if they hadn't, they would have failed. Unsurprised, Sarutobi nodded and evidently decided not to waste his breath repeating how important it was that Sasuke and Naruto both pass the test and receive training regardless of the consequences. Such a thing would be rather unnecessary at this point. And, in your opinion, how did they do? They did well, admits Kakashi after a pause. He didn't want to reveal too much now, and he couldn't quite recall what answers he had provided the last time. Here, a combination of the past and present would likely be the most effective approach. There was tension, as their files mentioned, but they were all fairly determined to pass. Enough to work together. Their plan was well put together. They each have potential. The Sandame sighed, seemingly relieved of a heavy burden. Good, he said. That's good. Kakashi nodded in agreement before saying, Sakura seems to have found a mention of the Uzumaki clan on one of her library escapades. She mentioned it to Naruto, who's completely run with it. Apparently, his newest goal is to become a Fuinjutsu master. The Hokage gazed at him, genuinely taken aback for once, before his eyes grew softer with long, forgotten sorrow and regrets. He looked at each year of his age in that instant, and Kakashi hoped that this time he would live, that he would live long enough to pass his hat on to Tsunade, and that he would finally take a short break, as he had been meant to do 13 years ago. Does he know about his parents? Not yet, Kakashi said falsely with ease, but I'd like to tell him about his mother, at least. After gliding past him and onto the wall, Sarutobi's eyes firmly settled on the portrait of the man who had succeeded him. He remained silent for a while, obviously absorbed in his own thoughts, and then he took a long drag from his pipe and released a trail of smoke. Yes, he said at last. Only a select few knew that Minato and Kushina were together and those that did know fully well who Naruto's parents are. But be careful, Kakashi. The boy is young, has barely made genin and has already been forced to carry one secret too large for his small shoulders. Knowledge of who his father is must not get out, not until he can defend himself properly. After being brutally silenced the first few times, Kakashi firmly held his opinions to himself, as he had done almost always on this issue. After losing the last two people who had ever meant anything to him, he was too overcome with grief to have the energy to fight for Naruto in the beginning as he should have. Without even taking into account the other man's loss, he had expected Jiraiya to fight valiantly for his godson and not give up until the infant was in his custody. Instead, he had allowed himself to wane into Anbu. Only years later, after he had been assigned to a 5-year-old Naruto's Anbu guard after the child had been expelled from the orphanage and left to live alone, as no child his age should be made to do, had he realized the full scope of his error. The decisions had all been made by then, the damage had been done, and Kakashi was not allowed to speak to the boy at all. It was probably the Sandame's idea of kindness to make him a regular on his guard, but after a while it got to be too much and he began to ask for out of village missions again. He was aware that he had been a coward. Even after being informed of the team assignments, All he wanted was to fail them right away so he wouldn't have to see Naruto again or confront the personification of his errors. He had only seen Minato. Sensei, when he had gazed at that blonde hair and those blue eyes, had seen Kushina, heard that unbridled laughter, and gazed at that big smile. Had witnessed Obito and had observed how Naruto would repeatedly fail but always get back up, never give up, and put everyone else before himself. Looking at him and not reacting, not pleading for forgiveness on his knees, and not fleeing as far as he possibly could had been extremely difficult. He had grown accustomed to hiding away and burying his pain deep, first through missions and then through his eccentricities. He maintained his shyness even after he was appointed Team 7's teacher, using the justification that he had to use Sasuke as a shield. Even though Sakura and Naruto had already forgiven him, he would spend the rest of his life trying to make up for the fact that he had been a coward all along. He was still only a Junin, though, still only a Junin, but perhaps an elite, someone already in the running for the hat. Here, he was unable to protest or challenge this decision. In the end, it would be a pointless endeavor, and doing so would only lead to punishment and make things more difficult for everyone. After all, Naruto was already aware of his father's identity, and although Kakashi wanted him to be able to proudly declare it in public, he understood that the boy was more interested in the fact that he had parents who had actually loved him than in that fact. "If you say so, sir," was his only response, and he let his tone do the talking. The Sandame's gaze darted to him, sharpening at once. Despite his advanced age, this man was still a Kage, one who had fought in several battles and earned the title of God of Shinobi. Most people, including most Junin, would have been intimidated by his mere presence, but Kakashi had confronted Uchiha Madara, a real god, and equaled his gaze. "What?" Sarutobi growled after a brief pause, his eyes narrowing in sharp disapproval. "Are you implying, soldier?" Kakashi said indifferently, "Nothing at all, sir," despite his heels snapping together and his posture straightening almost instinctively. To be honest, avoiding an Anbu regulation bow required some self-control, and that was amazing. Even though he had disapproved of the Sandame's decisions, Kakashi had always respected him, and this was just more evidence of how well deserving the man was. After holding his gaze for a moment longer, the Hokage gave a single, sharp nod and released his imposing aura. "I'll leave their training in your hands, as is your right, but I'd like updates on their progress. If there's nothing else, you're dismissed." Without saying another word, Kakashi nodded, bowed his head, and fled to the door as the Sandame once again lost himself in his thoughts while examining Minato's portrait on the wall. He was aware that the man had as many regrets as Kakashi, but they must be far more significant. He was not only in charge of himself, an Anbu squad, or a group of genin. He was also in charge of everyone inside the village and many more outside. Only the daimyo were more powerful than him in Fire Country. His decisions could never be simple. He had probably done the best he could at the time and was now forced to accept the results of his actions. As he strolled toward the barbecue restaurant, Kakashi concluded that occasionally filling his students' bellies was a small price to pay. Sasuke couldn't honestly say that he was surprised, but he wasn't sure how it had happened exactly either. Sakura had declared that they should finish their grocery shopping now since there was still time before the market closed for the evening after their dinner, which was paid for by a suspiciously cooperative Kakashi, especially considering the commotion he'd caused over ramen just that afternoon. It was true that they wouldn't want to do anything, much less shop, until their bodies adjusted to the amount of training they had planned for the near future. Additionally, Sakura knew the two of them well enough to know that they would immediately revert to their poor eating habits from this age if they had no other options. Sasuke would start eating small, incredibly bland meals that were technically healthy, while Naruto would happily eat a dozen cups of instant ramen in one sitting. They needed food for their planned training. Real, substantial portions of healthful food. Otherwise, they would only be hurting themselves. Sakura did indeed have a point. Was Sasuke more likely to consent to a shopping trip after that? Not especially. A quick look at his only source of income, since Kakashi had left before she had even completed the suggestion, the coward, revealed a Naruto who was happy and full and was now essentially willing to comply with anything after receiving 2 large meals in one day, including ramen, for free. Which, based on the arrogant grin their teammate gave him, had been Sakura's strategy from the beginning. He had thus sighed, scowled, and complained a little before finally giving in. Fortunately, the trip itself was less painful than the day before because it involved food rather than clothing, especially after Naruto put on his henge. Which brought them to this moment. With both of his teammates trotting along behind him, their arms as heavy with bags as his own, he is now making his way to his family's house through the pitch black and typically deathly quiet Uchiha compound. They weren't being quiet, But they also weren't being disrespectful. How dare they have such a pointless, trivial conversation here, in this empty place full of his family's ghosts? That would have sent Sasuke into a great rage the first time around at this age. As it was, Sasuke was incredibly thankful, even though he would acknowledge that it was strange to see people other than himself living on these streets. He had never invited anyone here before leaving, and he had never even considered doing so. It was completely unimaginable to a 12-year-old. The compound was gone by the time he returned. Years later, Pain's attack had destroyed it, and it had later been rebuilt as civilian housing. Though he had vaguely lamented its passing, he had not objected to the lands being used for other purposes. He had been somewhat relieved, in a sense. Despite the Hokage's repeated offers to house him elsewhere, he had always felt a connection to this place. It had been his home and his family's home, despite the nightmares that lurked in every nook and cranny. He had felt that giving up that final connection might have been just as much of a betrayal as Itachi's. And now that it was gone, destroyed, and replaced, he had lost the ability to make the choice, and he was strangely grateful for that. Subsequently, he awoke at 12 once more and lay in his former room in the home where he had been raised, surrounded by a profound silence that made his ears ring. It should come as no surprise to him that his teammates had noticed his unease with this location. It was startling, to put it mildly, to be surrounded by these ghosts again after he had already said his goodbyes and laid them to rest, and had caused him to have more sleep disruptions than he had in months. Naturally, Naruto had sensed his feelings, his hesitancy to spend another night here by himself, and the faces of the dead haunting his dreams. Sakura had undoubtedly observed his weariness and stress, even though they were concealed from practically everyone else. They knew him and could read him as well as he could read them, and since they were his teammates, they couldn't just stand by and let him handle it alone this time. They belonged to Team 7. They were no longer required to work alone. They apparently decided to follow him home like puppies in a nonchalant manner as a solution. Not requesting approval, not unsure if it was acceptable, just acting. At times, Sasuke was so appreciative of them that he nearly lost his mind. What could he have ever done to deserve them, given all the wrongdoing he had committed throughout his life? But whether they deserved it or not, they were there, and he had no intention of chasing them away. Therefore, he remained silent as they strolled through the deserted streets, listened to their uninteresting chatter, their hazy suggestions about how to incorporate their additional training into the already scheduled activities, and reveled in the fact that they were no longer alone. They arrived at his house without hesitation, didn't even stop to take off their shoes as they crossed the threshold directly behind him, followed him into the kitchen with the bags they were carrying, and put things away without even asking for instructions because they were already fairly familiar with the way he arranged things, as if they had been here countless times before rather than being invited in for the first time. Without hesitation, they followed him into his room, laid out extra blankets and futons on the floor, and went to bed. Did not pause, ask questions, or even appear to glance at one another in order to come to a consensus. Simply did, as if it were insignificant, as if it were clear that Sasuke was uncomfortable and alone in this place, and they could help him avoid it. He may never publicly acknowledge it, even if it meant facing death, but he genuinely loved his team. Even though he might not feel like he deserves them right now, he would definitely keep trying until he did. Amino Iruka had a passion for teaching. Like all kids, he had dreamed of becoming the next Hokage when he was younger. He had witnessed the passing of the hat from Sandaime to Yondaime from a distance, surrounded by people on all sides, even sitting on his father's shoulders. He had felt the joy of the entire village rise like a tidal wave as all of the voices joined in a single cheer. In that one bright moment, there was only happiness for the future all around him, despite the fact that so many people had died in the war. He had repeatedly dreamed about that moment. Even though the past and future Hokage figures were so small and hardly noticeable from a distance, their sheer presence had been overwhelming to him. They were the village's strongest members, its best guardians, and its last line of defense. Iruka had desired that more than he had ever desired anything in his life. The village was then attacked by the Kyuubi, and his whole world was reduced to ashes. Then he had been lost. In contrast to the abruptness of his parents' deaths, he had staggered around in a muck of rage, bitterness, and grief that seemed to suffocate his life and slowly drain it away. Ultimately, it had been the Sandaime who had dragged him out of that gloom, had demonstrated to him how to locate the light that remained within him, his will of fire extinguished to a mere ember but continuing to burn. It had rekindled his energy, and the loneliness of returning home each day to an empty house only strengthened his resolve to stand where the Yondaime had stood, to have the whole village cheer him on, for him, with him. Naturally, the years weren't always kind and often brought with them a lot of difficult lessons. Although Iruka had many skills and potential as a shinobi, it was quickly determined that he would probably never be a great one. He simply wasn't made for it. He lacked the unquestionable genius, the raw power, the vast reserves, and the precise control. Yes, he was intelligent, capable of passing any written exam, coming up with clever plans, and being able to sneak in, question, and trap the best of them, but he would never be able to compete with a Nara, especially one who wasn't driven. He would never be able to match the strength and skill of Guy, Kakashi, or any other Junin. He would never be their village's strongest member, their best defender, or their last line of defense. It had been a difficult reality to face, and he had spent months moving between departments, knowing he had the skills to fit in, but refusing to do so because doing so would mean giving up and admitting that the dream he had been pursuing for so long was actually unattainable, and he didn't want to do that. Everything seemed to fall into place for him after he accepted a mission to work as an aide at the academy, covering for a woman who had taken a few months of maternity leave. Of course, not everything was wonderful. The kids were noisy, unruly, and difficult to control. They misbehaved, ignored him, dozed off during his lectures, and quarreled over trivial matters. He seemed to spend the first few weeks apologizing endlessly to his own former teachers for everything he had done and everything he had put them through. In fact, he had sent a personalized basket of goods to each of them, and even though he had never said the words aloud, he knew they understood because of the smug grins they gave him whenever he saw them. Since these children were obviously not learning anything from him, it had initially seemed almost indecent and worthless. Unlike other teachers he had observed, he was unable to get them to sit, listen, and truly pay attention, and no amount of guidance or observation seemed to change that. After his class graduated, he witnessed the triumphant grins of those who had been given headbands, the disappointment mixed with tenacity of those who had failed, and a glimmer of pride in himself. Even though he didn't have much to offer, he had made a difference and helped mold these young boys and girls, which was a success. A few months after his brief time at the academy ended, he was working at the mission assignment desk and was blown away when two teens of the class he had worked with entered, all of them wearing Chunin vests with pride. He had assisted them in becoming shinobi, and they were no longer merely students or kids with aspirations of becoming shinobi. He had eagerly accepted the next mission that came up for a stay at the academy, resolutely ignoring the Hokage's sly glances. Additionally, getting the kids positioned and settled for lessons had appeared to be simpler than the previous time. Outliers, troublemakers, and slackers were always present, but this time he dealt with them more effectively and more quickly than the last time, when he had no idea what to do with them. Before long, he was attending the academy on mission after mission until he was there virtually all the time. The realization didn't come to him until the Hokage finally said something. He was no longer circling between departments, unsure of himself and hopeless about making a decision. Even when he had tentatively probed his feelings on the subject, there was no regret in it. He had already settled and it had been painless and had not hurt him in the least. Although he was removed from the active missions roster, given his own class, and assigned to the academy permanently the following year, he continued to assist with the mission assignment desk whenever he could, if only to get a glimpse of the children he had sent off to their careers and observe how they developed even though they were out of his reach. The Hokage appeared to comprehend, and the old man never objected to him spending an afternoon or two each week as long as his main concern was the children he was directly teaching. Iruka had been prepared and eager for his own class, his opportunity to claim that he had a direct hand in determining the direction of their forces rather than merely helping to shape it. He was unsure of how he could have ever believed that such a job was unappreciated. Subsequently, the Kyuubi container had entered his classroom, clad in soiled and worn clothing, with a smudged face and protectively hunched shoulders. However, when his eyes met his, they were bright and nearly defiant. Iruka was embarrassed to acknowledge that he had initially ignored the abuse. Even in his darkest moments, Iruka strongly doubted that he would ever be able to harm a child, and even through his grief, he was able to recognize that Naruto was a child. It wasn't done maliciously or anything. Beyond that, however, he was unsure of how to behave. Since he was still harboring the Kyuubi, the same monster that still haunted Iruka's worst nightmares, he was destroying his house, stealing his parents from him, killing a great number of people, including their Hokage, and leaving a trail of death, destruction, and wrath in its wake. He had therefore tried his best to ignore the boy, to do his best to instruct his class, including Naruto, without ever giving him much attention. And it appeared to work for a while. The boy appeared completely happy to be ignored, was reserved, uncertain, and made an effort to avoid drawing attention to himself if at all possible. Then all of a sudden, things changed. Naruto was suddenly acting out, talking back, and distracting the class in any way he could. He was also playing pranks almost all the time, to the point where Iruka was about to rip his own hair out because he didn't know how to handle the situation. Iruka was surprised when his co-workers proposed harsh penalties and immediate expulsion because, while it was undoubtedly annoying and disruptive, surely such drastic measures weren't required. Iruka had felt sick, really sick, with both them and himself after they had laughed and told him how they had disciplined the boy themselves, almost as if they were boasting about it. Even though he may not have physically harmed the boy, he may as well have done so by ignoring the situation. He was acting out in a way that was understandable. Even though he was always grinning, it didn't mean he was content. And he should deserve it if he was going to receive a severe punishment and be despised by everyone despite having done nothing wrong. He ought to be despised for his own sake, for reasons that he genuinely understood and was aware of. Ignoring his lingering concerns about the Kyuubi and concentrating solely on Naruto had been challenging at first, but it had soon gotten easier. No matter how he was treated, he was a boisterous child who seemed to be bursting with energy, but he was also intelligent when given the chance and always had a smile ready for anyone who really needed it. When you put aside all the mischief, he was a good kid who deserved the same opportunity to pursue his goals as the other students in his class. To ensure that Naruto spent his days in class instead of running around or sitting in detentions he hadn't even earned, Iruka made every effort to level the playing field. He had to try to avoid showing favoritism as he grew closer to the boy because doing so would not only be unfair but would also undoubtedly cost him control over the other students right away. He repeatedly saw Naruto fail his exam, and each time his heart ached for the boy. He wanted to simply hand the Hite.8 over and give him a pat on the head, but that would probably be the quickest way to kill him. Iruka never wished to let his students down, but he even less wished to send them off unprepared. Even though he had been making every effort to ignore Naruto, he had always recognized that he had the potential to be a skilled shinobi. Iruka was certain that he would succeed because it would only take a few more teachers to give him a chance. It was validated when Naruto defeated a traitorous Chunin by himself after learning a jutsu that was on par with that of a Junin in just a few hours. When Iruka claimed that Naruto was one of the best students he had ever had and that he was, in fact, Naruto and not the Kyuubi, he wasn't lying. Iruka, who was tying his Hite.8 around Naruto's forehead, had never been more pleased with a graduating student or more thrilled to see a student rise through the ranks and develop into a skilled shinobi. Naruto would undoubtedly be a great shinobi, but Iruka might have had to make do with being a decent one. And so, while he blatantly ignored the amused looks the Sandaime continued to give him, he could confess to being a little restless as he waited for the final of the recently graduated teams to arrive. After passing their final exams to become formally genin under their Junin sensei, teams 8 and 10 had already arrived to pick up a mission, and they all looked proud in their own unique ways. They all sagged and started to complain and drag their feet, which was always funny to watch, until they were told exactly what kind of mission they would be accepting. And really, Iruka went over mission ranks and what they entailed every year. How was it still such a surprise to these kids? However, it was now mid-afternoon and Team 7 had not yet appeared. It wasn't like Kakashi could reverse that without a good, unquestionable reason because he had already officially passed them. Iruka wouldn't be shocked if he didn't take his responsibility as a teacher seriously, but he still had obligations, like sending his students on D-rank missions, and he couldn't avoid them without getting in trouble, unless he had good cause. Where were they, then? His shift was coming to an end, and he was eager to see all of his children before being sent home for the night. The room fell suddenly and shockingly silent as Team 7 entered, almost as if called by the thought. Iruka's jaw was hanging open the way it was, so he couldn't really blame anyone. Because the Team 7 that was in front of him now was different from the one he had been assigned 2 days prior. He wanted to put the blame on the clothes because they had all changed from their bright, eye-catching outfits to something more appropriate, and he wanted to be proud of that, he did. But for some reason, he knew that wasn't the case. It was still very odd to see Naruto wearing something that could actually be called subtle. It was almost wrong. Oh, he could see the people around him observing the physical details and dismissing it as such, even as they nodded in agreement with Kakashi for apparently ordering or inspiring such a change. Iruka, however, knew there was more to it. Perhaps it was the way they positioned themselves in front of the desk, at ease with their close proximity to one another. There was no fighting, no posturing, and no glares exchanged between Naruto and Sasuke. Seemingly assured that they could get along without a buffer, Sakura stood to the far left rather than between them. Furthermore, she appeared unconcerned of the fact that she wasn't standing as close to the Uchiha heir as she could manage, standing with Naruto between her and Sasuke. Perhaps it was all of this plus the fact that they looked unkempt, covered in dust and grime, obviously exhausted from a demanding training session, yet they stood tall and proud, refusing to back down. None of these three appeared to be academy kids or even recent graduates. No, they had a shinobi-like appearance. The spell was then broken when Naruto yelled, "Hey, Iruka. Sensei. Hey, Gigi. Got any cool missions for us?" Something with princesses and a lot of fights, with a big, happy smile. As Sasuke sneered and Kakashi sighed in frustration from behind his book's pages, and, really, in front of kids? Sakura rolled her eyes, but the Hokage just laughed, accustomed to the boy's disrespect and actually enjoying it. Even though Iruka was accustomed to it and even liked it, she couldn't ignore it. It was expected of Naruto to act professionally. What if the room had contained a client? Naruto, don't talk that way to the Hokage. Address him with respect. Iruka had to fight the impulse to bury his face in his hands as Naruto smiled cheekily, mischief gleaming in his eyes. Hadn't he just made things worse? You're absolutely right, Iruka. Sensei. Got any cool missions for us, Gigi? Sama? Iruka gave it up for a loss as the room echoed with sighs, some irritated but mostly grudgingly amused. For the time being. Naruto was quite adamant about his beliefs, and he truly showed respect by giving the Hokage such a loving nickname. The boy would only dig in his heels and fight back if the matter were pushed at this point. Most people would assume that would lead to pranks. It would probably give Iruka headaches he didn't need. The Hokage said solemnly, his eyes gleaming with laughter when Naruto let out a disappointed cry, "I'm afraid we're fresh out of princess rescue missions, but we do have a rescue mission, in a manner of speaking." Iruka wasn't certain if he would use that term. In fact, releasing the object would likely qualify as rescuing it more than giving it back to its owner. However, considering how much they were paid on a regular basis, and for a D rank at that, it was worth it, as long as the cat wasn't physically mistreated. The Sandame took a scroll from the pile in front of him, quickly examining its contents before handing it to a patient Sakura. It seems that Madame Shijimi's cat has escaped and gotten lost in the village. She's understandably very worried and would like her dear pet returned to her as soon as possible. Do you think the three of you are up for it? When all three gave the Hokage drab looks, Iruka had to suppress a snort because 3 genin against a cat? They were game, of course. He could acknowledge that he felt a little guilty. It was highly unlikely that they would be able to capture it without getting hurt, and that cat was the devil. Not that he could blame it for wanting to cling desperately to its freedom. Despite being spoiled, the creature was shrewd, swift, and ferocious. I'm surprised this mission wasn't already picked up. Surely it would be a perfect fit for Team 8. Iruka had to fight the urge to choke the man as Kakashi hummed as the mission scroll was handed back to him and tucked it into his pocket without even giving it a quick glance. The final statement, which announced that it was just after 2 in the afternoon, was delivered with a sharp look at the Junin and then the wall clock. Oh. Kurenai decided to start them off a bit easier, it seems. I'm afraid most of the ideal missions go to those who show up in time to receive them. Iruka may hold him in the highest regard, but he was pretty certain that he would never truly like him. Kakashi simply shrugged his shoulders, unapologetic. Ma, it's fine. This mission is perfect, isn't it, kids? Surprisingly, the 3 genin did not voice any complaints despite appearing extremely dissatisfied with the mission and their teacher. Even though they didn't appear particularly pleased about the mission, they all appeared perfectly willing to comply and complete it, which is something Iruka would have expected given Naruto's presence in the room. For a moment, Iruka's concern for others overcame his professionalism, and he couldn't resist asking, "Are you sure?" He was telling the truth when he said that they appeared to have just finished a challenging training session. This isn't the easiest mission and all 3 of you look like you've already had a long day. His intended effect was reversed by his words. They all straightened up impossibly taller, seemingly insulted at the thought of giving up before they had even begun, rather than acknowledging their own states or acknowledging that they might be tired. No way. A frowning Naruto protested. We've got this mission in the bag, no question about it, Datbeo. HN. Really, Iruka? Sensei, there's no need to worry, Sakura said with a smile that appeared somewhat strained. We can handle it. Since they were still children and had only been his students a few days prior, he briefly considered pushing the issue. However, he paused to observe their resolute faces and simply couldn't bring himself to question them. They were putting in more effort than any other team had up to this point in order to fulfill their goals and become stronger, and he simply could not obstruct that right now. Instead, he inhaled deeply and smiled at them with approval, "If you're sure." As a group, they nodded back to him, and wasn't that odd? What could have happened in such a short period of time that could have turned the veritable ticking time bomb that was Team 7 into this? Then to the Hokage. And finally, without saying anything more than Naruto's yelled goodbye, they turned to follow their sensei out. To be honest, Iruka wasn't sure how he felt about it. Most developed gradually so that he could follow along from the sidelines, as they matured and grew. However, Team 7 appeared to have advanced in maturity more quickly. Perhaps Naruto's situation could be explained by what had transpired with Mizuki, but what about the other two? It was impossible for Iruka to avoid feeling perplexed and, if he was being honest with himself, a little suspicious. He was more proud of his students, though, than he could articulate. He had no doubt that they would be great in the future. Even though Sakura and Sasuke were clearly exhausted, it was very easy to catch Torah. The bulk of Naruto's soreness had been relieved by his recuperation and endurance, leaving him nearly fully recovered and prepared to go. Despite not having a biju in their stomach to restore their energy, Sakura had applied her healing methods to both herself and Sasuke. Nevertheless, they had never grumbled or slowed down, as committed to completing the mission as they were to retraining themselves to a respectable level. To be honest, Kakashi Sensei hadn't been lying when he said that the morning session had been hell. Naruto had always been a stamina freak and had to struggle to stay going. He didn't know how bushy brows did it so enthusiastically every day, but he certainly had Naruto's admiration for it. Naruto was a little disappointed by Iruka Sensei's remark because he recalled that they were just newly graduated genin here, not fourth war heroes who had faced an actual godhead. Head. Iruka hadn't looked at Naruto, or any of them, that way in a very long time. As if they were children, he felt compelled to intervene and shield them because he wasn't sure if they could manage. Although it was discouraging, Naruto didn't hold him responsible and was even somewhat appreciative because there weren't many people in this era who would truly go out of their way to protect him in that way. Since they could do it and they weren't kids, would go to any lengths to accomplish it. They were legally adults now, shinobi, and they wouldn't have needed to be pampered like civilian children even if they hadn't had their 18-year-old brains. It felt like they were being pampered, even though Iruka didn't mean it that way. All he wanted was for the people he loved to be safe and for the students he watched develop to be able to handle what they were given. It seemed as though they were being questioned. They detested it as well. However, there was only one way to alter it, and that was to disprove each of those presumptions. This entailed mastering their missions, training until they passed out, becoming strong enough that no one doubted their ability to handle a situation, and then becoming even stronger. They would never stop striving for it, even though it would take a very long time to regain the respect and authority they had before being sent back. And that meant catching a cat and giving her back to her owner, who was borderline abusive, which left Naruto with a slight retaste, despite the fact that the thing was as demonic as it could be. Torah was easy to find. Naruto only needed to focus for a moment without moving and close his eyes. The majority of the animals in the village, except for Ninken, had chakra signatures so tiny that they were easily overshadowed by the number of shinobi present, so it wouldn't have been nearly as easy with any other animal. Finding Torah wasn't as difficult as it might have been because Naruto knew her and had dealt with this mission more times than he wanted to remember. After all, patience, chakra control, and a solid plan were all that were required. In fact, the speed at which they had her ensnared and submissive in Naruto's grasp was almost offensive given how challenging this had been the first time. Which was another rather strange thing. Naruto was fairly certain that Torah had previously detested him, had sparked an unholy argument when he had been temporarily in charge of transporting her back to Hokage Tower, and had stung him so severely that, had Kurama not intervened, he would have probably been scarred. However, this time she appeared to give up as soon as she was in his arms, and when he tentatively started to stroke her back, she actually started to purr. Before the three of them started to head back, each watching the cat in case this good behavior turned out to be a trick, he exchanged an incredulous and, to be honest, alarmed look with his teammates. They would all agree that Torah was smart, frighteningly so, even though she might just be an ordinary cat. However, she remained composed and happy all the way back, until they found themselves in front of the Hokage and once again the target of a room full of incredulous stares. Torah didn't appear to return to reality until Madame Shijimi squealed and lunged forward, her hands clenched in an insistent grasp. Even though she didn't make another attempt to flee, she dug her claws into Naruto's jacket and gave him a look of desperate desperation that made him turn in an attempt to keep her away from her pet. The room fell silent, much more so than it had been this morning. Because the fire daimyo's wife was more than just a client. One mistake could lead to a severe backlash, less money, and fewer missions. Even though it was unlikely to last long, Naruto could throw Konoha into poverty with just one mistake, making them the strongest hidden village in the elemental nations. After all, their daimyo was different from the wind's daimyo. That would have been an issue if Naruto had actually been 12. He had no concept of diplomacy or respect when he was really this age, and he had fought most of his battles with fists and passionate yelling. Neither of those tactics would help him much in this situation, unless it was directly related to trouble. However, his mental state had changed from that of a 12-year-old. At times, it was difficult to understand what that actually meant beyond possessing a weak, undertrained body, a large jutsu repertoire, and insight into future events. Even though Naruto couldn't compete with most at the moment, that didn't mean he had no power. Tsunade and several other department heads still had to train him for months. Even if it was just a cat, he could help someone, and he had never been the kind to turn away from a good opportunity. How could he do it now without everyone assuming a body snatcher had taken his place? The fact that Iruka, sensei, had apparently already been sent home made him very happy. "Madam Shijimi, you must relax," he commanded, his arms encircling the cat he was holding in a reassuring manner. Obligingly, Torah started purring again, loudly enough to be heard all over the room. Naruto wasn't sure if it was because of the way he'd spoken to her or because she had never heard her cat purr before, but the daimyo's wife appeared more amazed than any of the shinobi around her, even those whose facial expressions had faltered. Really, either was just as likely. Torah doesn't like it when you get too excited with her and handle her roughly. That's why she keeps running away from you. Cats aren't like dogs, they don't respond to stuff like that in a good way. You have to give her space and be gentle with her and she'll come to you. There was more silence, and Naruto started to question whether this had been a poor last-minute choice. Kakashi was just a few seconds away from hitting his head on a wall, but a sidelong glance revealed that his teammates were completely unsurprised by his behavior, albeit frustrated. None of them appeared to be disapproving. Indeed, neither did the Hokage. Yes, he was surprised and as frustrated as Naruto's teammates, but more than anything, he appeared amused by this development and perhaps even slightly satisfied, as if he had long desired to do the same but had been unable to. Which was foolish. Being the Hokage meant that he had more duties than anyone else and had to exercise greater caution in both his words and deeds, but it also meant that he could be less cautious. After all, there was a big difference between a genin and the village chief voicing such worries to the daimyo's wife. However, what was done, and Naruto could only hope that Madam Shijimi interpreted it as advice given with good intentions rather than as an insult. Well, a little, but mostly because of the way she regularly choked her cat to death, and that people began paying closer attention to Team 7's other choices and didn't question this one too much, because that would undoubtedly be detrimental. Fortunately, the woman appeared to gather herself, drawing tall and patting at her robes to make sure everything was in order, rather than exploding at Naruto in rage as he had half expected. "My little fuzzykins sure has taken a liking to you, hasn't she? I haven't seen her that content in ages," she uttered, her face beaming with delight. "Or ever," Naruto considered, but mustered the restraint to remain silent. "What a precious thing. What's your name, dear?" He introduced himself as Uzumaki Naruto, looking at the Hokage again before firmly focusing on the woman in front of him. "If you want Torah to stop running away, then you can't smother her like that. She really doesn't like it." She immediately resorted to baby talk, cooing over the cat as Naruto reluctantly and gently handed her over. I see. She does seem quite happy with the way you're holding her, don't you, baby? Do you want mommy to hold you like that, too? Will that keep you from being such a naughty little thing?" she said. As was customary, Torah tensed in anticipation of a lunge for escape if her owner chose to strangle her affectionately, but she was surprisingly docile for the most part. Rather, Madam Shijimi held the cat loosely, just enough to hold it in her arms, and appeared ecstatic when Torah stayed there without resisting. "Oh, how lovely. You do love mommy. Yes you do. Yes you do. Thank you so much for retrieving my baby." Naruto sighed silently as the madam walked away without turning around, her entire focus firmly fixed on lavishing tender love on the creature in her arms. He was extremely happy that it had been received so favorably. He was fairly certain that it would not have happened if Madam Shijimi had been any less vapid than she was. The Hokage said, "Very well done," as soon as the daimyo's wife left the room. The surrounding shinobi, obviously aware that the show was now over, returned to their work slowly. "As first missions go, you've done an outstanding job." Sakura muttered, "Thank you, Hokage Sama," as she gave their mission scroll to be completed and stamped. The statement, of course, "We're the best team, after all. That mission wasn't hard at all," was absolutely accurate. The mission had been extremely easy. No aspect of the mission had been as stressful as the last 5 minutes. "I see," the Sandame said with a friendly laugh, "and I hope you'll keep up the good work in the future." "You bet, Gigi." Kakashi Sensei interrupted, his eyes curved in a glaringly fixed smile. "If that's all, Hokage Sama, it seems my cute little students need a bit more training if that's how they decide to address royalty." "I'm sorry." With a nervous laugh, Naruto scratched the back of his head in shame. But he didn't regret it, and he wasn't ashamed. More training couldn't be a bad thing right now, anyway, and Sakura and Sasuke obviously agreed as they slumped without objecting or even giving Naruto a scolding glance. The order was given absently, more by rote than by any expectation that it would be followed, and Kakashi Sensei simply gave them a lazy salute before escorting them out of the building, trying to keep their pace calm when all he wanted was to whisk them away from any ears that might be listening. Very well. I'll see you tomorrow. Do try to arrive at a more respectable time, Kakashi. He was able to wait until they returned to their training grounds and he had put up a crude privacy seal. He then let out a long, exhausting sigh after sort of just standing there, looking for the world in despair. At last, he said, "Really?" as his hand reached up to pinch the bridge of his nose in a way that Naruto chose not to reveal and made him resemble Tsunade. Ba-chan. We're supposed to be fitting in, not drawing attention. That was the opposite of not drawing attention. When Kakashi Sensei glared at Sasuke, he shrugged and said, "I don't see what the problem is. That's exactly something that Dobi would have done, if that Hellcat had behaved even half as well before." He was telling the truth, however, Naruto would have treated it with much less deference. Besides, this is a good thing. Sakura upbeatly added. The Sandame was clearly happy about it and it ended well, with no hard feelings. In fact, Madame Shijimi even seemed pleased. What's there to complain about? After a brief period of silence, Kakashi Sensei's shoulders abruptly drooped. "I give up," he declared out loud. "You three are ridiculous and impossible and I give up." Since Kakashi Sensei had known them for how long and had genuinely believed they could still be subdued, the three of them exchanged smiles. But before they could respond, their teacher raised his head once more to look into each of their eyes, one by one, and they had to suppress a shiver at the barely disguised sadistic joy that lit up his eye from the inside out. That appearance also reminded me a lot of Tsunade. Ba-chan. So, if you won't watch your behavior to avoid situations like that, I'll just have to make sure you're too tired to even think of acting out. Simple solution, right? Even though they are eager to train, this might be a bit too much for them to handle. However, they were not going to back down from such a challenge. Instead, Team 7 moved forward as a unit to meet it. "Naruto, I'm gonna knock your head clean off your shoulders." "That's gross, Sakura. Chan. Shit, Dobi. Stop riling her up while I'm in range of her fists." "Then get out of range, Teme. Do you want to get tagged?" Satisfied with the world, Kakashi sighed as he watched his children do everything in their power to beat the living daylights out of one another. It appeared that he had finally arrived at a successful training strategy after much trial and error. To be honest, he had been a little confused about what to do at first. Kakashi was always brilliant. He had been called that since before he could recall, which was actually saying something, according to his memory. He had always had the ability to pick up ideas and concepts fast, sometimes even before they were fully explained to him. With his rise through the shinobi ranks, he was able to set records, and it wasn't conceited to suggest that, aside from the Hokage and Guy when he opened his gates, Kakashi might be the strongest person in the village right now. He had never been particularly inventive, though. It's true that he could improvise on missions if necessary and could quickly devise sound strategies. If he hadn't been able to do at least that, let alone be permitted to lead his own Anbu team, he would never have advanced past the rank of Chunin. However, he was accustomed to doing things like that and wouldn't really classify them as creativity. Anyhow, despite having Namikaze Minato as his teacher, there was a reason he had only made progress in his Fuinjutsu training. There was a reason he had only ever personally created one jutsu, even though he was known to be able to perform over 1,000. By nature, Kakashi was not a creative person, not in the sense that Minato Sensei had been, and definitely not in the sense that Naruto was now. However, by their second week together, Kakashi had started to scrounge together all of his creativity for his students' instruction. If anything, they needed incentive to stop, not that they needed incentive. They could all easily run themselves into the ground, exhaust themselves completely, and then force their bodies to continue moving forward. Although that time came much sooner now, the idea remained the same. Team 7 members would train until they literally passed out if left to their own devices. After much deliberation, Kakashi came up with the following solution. Games. It turns out that despite their extreme stubbornness, they were also absurdly competitive. Additionally, the game had to end, not because everyone had passed out, in order for there to be a definite winner. Their initial skepticism was evident to him. Although their team had trained in a variety of ways, including running fictitious missions and basic exercises and sparring, they had never experienced anything like this. He could see that they felt he was just treating them like children, and they weren't happy about it. They had already had to readjust to bodies that were much younger than they were used to, and the expectations had been lowered to match them. Naturally, this suspicion didn't last for more than a day. Kakashi didn't even really have any personal experience to draw from, so he had no idea how to treat kids. Because he believed they couldn't handle it, he treated them like children, essentially the same way he behaved the first time. Not taking them seriously or providing them with the necessary training. Clearly, that had not worked out. There is no use in repeating the same error twice. They began their days with the customary exercises and warm-ups. Running laps, followed by lunges, squats, push-ups, and sit-ups, followed by more laps, katas, and then more laps. In actuality, it was the simplest method of gaining endurance, which Sakura and the others desperately needed. Naturally, at least for the time being, he had different requirements for how many laps each of them needed to complete. Sakura had the fewest laps and Naruto the most, a fact she had scowled loudly over but had not voiced any complaints about. After that, they practiced taijutsu for an hour and a half, switching opponents. By the end, the person with the fewest wins had to pay for lunch. This was a bet, and none of them were going to back down from that, and, oh, how he delighted in their reactions to that little tidbit. Their little faces had been so indignant before that natural competitiveness had kicked in. Actually, his adorable little pupils made it so simple, but they still questioned why he kept frightening them in this way. Their daily task followed a hearty lunch, typically supplied by an enraged Sakura. Never mind that perpetual tardiness was one of the staples he was best known for. The regulars of the mission assignment desk had stopped raising their eyebrows at the rate at which they tended to finish whatever they'd been assigned. They probably just chalked it up to the fact that they were being taught by the Hitaki Kakashi. The Hokage, at least, appeared extremely happy with Team 7's apparent development. And it was here that he had been compelled to use his inventiveness. Initially, he would assign additional laps and exercises after missions until it was time to head home for dinner. That was his plan, anyway. He hadn't seen anything wrong with it because, after all, that was how he'd always trained. It was naive of him, because when you were working with as much tenacity, desperation, as his students were, it was very easy to lose yourself in that way. Once upon a time, had he not been the same, he couldn't recall how many times he'd woken up on the training field after losing Obito, being tended by a somber Rin and a worried but resigned Minato. He had to be better and stronger because he couldn't lose anyone else and had to defend what he had left. His pupils were approaching their work with a very similar mindset. They did, after all, anticipate some threats far in advance of others. They also needed to be prepared. They could not afford to relax. If they did, there was a very real chance that the world would end. They refused to heed his advice and continued into the late hours of the night, long after darkness had fallen, rather than stopping at the sensible hour he had assumed they would. He had let them do as they pleased, sighed, and assumed that when they woke up the following day to incredibly sore bodies, they would have learned their lesson. However, they hadn't. They had done the same thing the next night, even after Sakura had lightly healed them, even though he knew they must have been in pain, apart from Naruto, the cheater, and the subsequent evening. Haruno Kazashi may have been impressed by her development, but he was not impressed at all when his daughter came home 3 nights in a row, exhausted to the point of unconsciousness. What was he to do, anyway? Eliminate them early enough to prevent it? He could, but he was certain that it wouldn't be worth it given their retaliation for such an act. Can you punish them? The only punishment he could really think of was to give them more training, which was exactly what they needed. Place an order. He simply knew that after listening, they would go home and train independently until they achieved the same outcome. Creativity follows. Shinobi parents tried to start training their kids early while still letting them enjoy their childhood by teaching them a lot of games. Despite the fact that Kakashi had never played these games himself and had considered them beneath his dignity even as a conceited puppy, he had witnessed his classmates playing them during his one and only year at the academy. He only needed to raise the stakes a bit. Or, more accurately, a lot. He began with Ninja Tag, enjoying the shocked expressions his students had given him. But unlike the kid version, it featured live weapons and the occasional jutsu, and it was only played in the trees. Touching the ground at any time resulted in immediate disqualification. Hide and seek followed, but instead of just tagging, discovery was followed by battle and capture because of how loud their clumsy limbs were in the woods, making him cringe. Blind man's bluff followed, as hide and seek had disclosed that their senses had been severely damaged and that chakra could only help them to a certain extent. His understanding of schoolyard games was limited to that, and he was reluctant to solicit suggestions from his students. Ultimately, neither boy had experienced what could be considered a typical upbringing, and based on his understanding, Sakura had only the Yamanaka heir as a friend. He was happy with what they had, though, for the time being. And judging from their current battle through the trees, his students appeared to share this sentiment. "You're dead. You're both dead. Way to go, Dobi. If she kills me, I'm going to haunt you." "Hey, that's not something to joke about. You know ghosts freak me out." The way they got along was so cute, it was nearly enough to make him cry. Sakura's incoherent screams and Naruto's provocative laughter reverberated through the otherwise quiet forest as they drew steadily farther away from Kakashi, who sighed in satisfaction and then leapt after them. After all, having to confront the Hokage and explain that his students had killed one another over a kid's game would be a terrible shame. Sakura made a concerted effort to avoid dragging her feet, but she was fairly certain that she was failing. They had been officially named Team 7, again, for nearly 3 weeks. She still expected to be an 18-year-old Junin when she woke up each day, rather than a child who was hardly a genin. Her father considered her progress to be almost miraculous. He had frequently made remarks about it, boasting about his brilliant daughter and joking about his own permanent genin status. Her mother had sighed, pressed her lips together, and merely nodded in agreement. But Sakura wasn't shocked. Mebuki had never been a shinobi in the first place, and Haruno Kazashi had never achieved Chunin rank, not because he didn't try. It had taken a lot of convincing for her mother to allow Sakura to enroll in the academy. Even though she had been a ninja's wife, Mebuki had a very different perspective on the life of a ninja because she was a civilian born and raised, even though her father had been all for it. At this age, Sakura took great pride in her dresses and long, beautiful hair because she was their little girl and her mother's only real experience with raising a child was from her own upbringing. Not just because Sasuke liked long hair, she didn't know how she could have been so intelligent and so naive. At this age, Sasuke didn't like anything that didn't make him stronger, but also because it was a topic of conversation and a way for her and her mother to connect. Because of this, Sakura's mother had been unsure of how to respond to all of the abrupt changes she had been making lately, including to her hair, clothes, and now her diet and level of fitness. However, she continued to make every effort to be helpful, and Sakura was incredibly appreciative of that. But Sasuke was one area in which her parents were undoubtedly unsupportive. Or, more precisely, the nights she spent at his house. She was unable to hold them responsible. They saw her as a 12-year-old girl staying overnight at a boy's house without any kind of supervision. She was their little girl, their beloved daughter, and they were wary of anything that could undermine her virtue, so it didn't matter that, in the village's eyes, she was an adult from the moment she received her Hide.8. They were also well aware of her feelings regarding the Uchiha. Sakura was fairly certain that everyone in the village understood her feelings regarding the Uchiha. She had kept that information to herself because bringing up the fact that Naruto was also present would have probably made matters worse. Like the previous time, they had been cautious when they learned that he had been put on her team, but they had only warned her to exercise caution. Hearing them express that level of fear in relation to Naruto, the shining star, had still hurt. At this age, it was just another thing she had failed to notice. Unlike so many others in the village, they had never treated Naruto badly, but it was still awful enough to warn her to stay away from him. Her parents had long since become accustomed to him by the time she learned of his Jinchuriki status and connected it to the treatment he received. That was not the case anymore. Sakura didn't want to despise or hate her parents the way she felt compelled to feel against the people who mistreated Naruto. She didn't know if it was selfish or not. However, she simply couldn't bring herself to feel such unpleasant feelings for them. In any case, Naruto would not want her to. Nevertheless, it had caused her to lose some respect for them. As a result, their attempts to chastise her for spending the night at a boy's house didn't have the same effect as they could have. She still pretended to be sorry and expressed regret for worrying them and not informing them in advance, but she would not promise not to do it again. She knew she didn't have to spend every night there. Sasuke would never anticipate it or ask for it, but that was irrelevant. Naruto had no one to live with, no curfews to adhere to, and he would be happy to spend all of his free time at the Uchiha compound if Sasuke required it. There would be bad nights, though, nights when she would dream about death and see her teammates dead and gone, the world left to decay under Kaguyu's rule, or she would arrive at the Valley of the End too late, always too late, and discover them bled out. Visions like that dancing behind her eyelids would make it impossible for her to remain in the house she grew up in. It would be a lie to promise otherwise. Kakashi. Sensei's voice called out from above the tree she was walking beneath, "Pick those feet up, Sakura," and she immediately complied, despite the fact that doing so only made them burn more intensely. 3 more laps. Sakura responded without holding her breath. She was aware that she only had 2 of the number he had initially assigned her because she had been keeping a very precise mental count. She had discovered this the first time she had been doing this, but the number had been far, far smaller than the one she was working on now, and she also knew that pointing it out would not help her. 5 laps around the training grounds had been completed at that point. It was 30 now. It made sense to her that she was making rapid progress. She knew this from her father's responses as well as from her own increasing strength and endurance. Her speed and stealth had also significantly improved as a result of Kakashi Sensei's addition of the redesigned ninja games to their afternoon training. Still, it was much too slow for her taste. Particularly when Sasuke and Naruto would pass her on a lap numbering in the 40s, moving at a speed she couldn't possibly match. Or perhaps even in the 1950s for Naruto. She gritted her teeth, raised her feet, and quickened her pace after experiencing a fresh surge of resolve. 3 more laps, Kakashi Sensei had said. She would make it 4. Danzo has to die. Sasuke's declaration was met with complete silence, though he wasn't shocked. The unexpected thing was that Naruto hadn't immediately started shouting objections. They had only discovered the matrix for the privacy seal of the Uchiha compound the day before, and they had been there for 3 weeks. Even though Sasuke knew he should, he hadn't been searching very hard for it. In all the years he had lived here alone, he had never seen it, which, to be honest, should have been his first hint as to where it was. As a child, the only places he had flatly refused to go into were his parents' and brother's rooms. Since the security seals had also been tied into it, it was only natural that his father would want such a thing nearby in case of an emergency. And the clan head's room was the ideal location for it. Sasuke may have found some peace over the tragedy that had been his family's demise, but some things still felt sacred to him. He may no longer be the young boy who wore anger like a cloak to conceal the heartbreaking loneliness and endless heartache that were hidden deep inside. One of those had been his parents' room. However, this was crucial, and he could only claim training fatigue for so long. Although they might have felt comfortable carefully going over some topics in public, they needed to be absolutely sure that no onlookers could overhear this particular conversation. As he demonstrated quite clearly in his opening remarks. And when none of his teammates were protesting, it really made a statement. Yes, Naruto did appear to want to, as if he were desperately trying to think of another option, but they all knew that there was none. And Sasuke's thoughts were not prompted by his still burning rage because he had already exacted his revenge on the bastard and understood what it was like to kill him in retaliation for all the suffering, death, and anguish he had caused him, his clan, and his brother. No, this was for a completely different purpose. That man has his nose in everything, played a role in every horrific thing that has happened or will take advantage of any moment of weakness to gain control of Konoha. He's strong, he has an army, and he's convinced that what he's doing is for the good of the village. He won't stop. And the Sandaime won't stop him. Resignation caused Naruto to grit his teeth and draw his mouth into a frown that was much harsher than anything Sasuke had ever seen on his face at this age. At least not until they had first met at the valley. Naruto's eyes darkened with pain at a difficult decision. And that army isn't even his, not really. They're just kids that he broke and molded into whatever he wanted. Sakura interrupted abruptly. Sasuke glanced at her, noticed the tension in her body, and the way her fists were coiled together on the table to prevent them from lashing out. He blinked in mild surprise. Sakura was known to have anger management issues, but she was typically quick to ignite and quick to burn. This time, however, her rage simmered slowly and continued to burn until it was completely extinguished. Sasuke had spent the great majority of his life dealing with that type of hatred, but he had never imagined seeing it so obviously manifested in one of his teammates. It was disturbing. Naturally, she would have witnessed the aftermath. The things that man did to them, she uttered, closing her eyes as though she were resisting the horror. She was a disciple of Tsunade, one of her most trusted people, and the only living person who could possibly compete with the Godaime's medical skills, aside from Shizune. Naturally, she would have been asked to assist in the healing and reintegration of the dozens of brainwashed operatives that had been left behind after the elder's tragic death. Danzo was a man who, without hesitation, could order the deaths of hundreds of people, including the youngest infant, who lived in his own village. He could then place the blame on a 13-year-old boy, desecrate the bodies, steal from them, and implant parts of them into his own body, all while living a comfortable life. Sasuke had no desire to learn what more the man could tolerate or what he could do to his own people, who would have lost the ability to resist or refuse. Before she could say anything more, Kakashi interrupted. Sometimes there aren't any easy choices, for which Sasuke could only be thankful. The blonde felt the same way and was embarrassed about it, judging by the grimace on Naruto's face. Sometimes, bad people just don't give you a choice. Madara was the same, as was Kaguya. But that was different. Naruto exclaimed, at last losing the ability to contain himself. Madara was already dead and we sealed Kaguya. And if killing them had been our only option? Kakashi asked gently. Given Naruto's obvious pain and difficulty in accepting such a thing, it probably would have appeared cruel and heartless to someone who didn't know him, but they all knew better. This teacher, who was also their team leader at the time, was attempting to assist Naruto in accepting the decision that they had all already made. Because Sasuke had killed the bastard once before and was more than willing to do it again, he had no qualms about it. Sakura was a trained medical professional who, despite being tasked with saving lives, was by no means unfamiliar with death. She valued life enough to want someone who blatantly ignored it to stop. Additionally, Kakashi had been a legend at Anbu for years before Sasuke joined. However, Naruto had always been unique. Despite all of the suffering he had endured as a child, he was naturally upbeat, bright, and happy, and he could find joy even in the most difficult situations. Sasuke thought that the only way to describe him was that he was so pure, like a child, but that was incorrect because he had never had a child's eyes. Darkness was nothing new to him, but unlike Sasuke, he would never allow it to affect him. It would be like asking the sun to go out, or asking birds to stop flying, or asking the earth to stop spinning, to ask Naruto to consciously plan the death of someone, even someone as terrible as Danzo. It was by far the hardest thing they could have asked him to consent to. Even though some things had to be done, even if they were difficult or unsightly, Sasuke refused to take it back. However, his 12-year-old self would have immediately set himself on fire after using such a gentle tone with the dobi. But Sasuke didn't care. Kakashi and I can do it, he offered. From the other side of the table, the only one of them who was physically an adult looked into his eyes and gave him a single, determined nod. Sasuke opened his mouth to argue because this had to be done, but Naruto's voice was ragged and pained, and he continued in a tone that brooked no arguments. No, I'm not going to just close my eyes and pretend like it's not happening. I'm not gonna sit here and plan this and leave you to bloody your hands for it alone. To do that would make me no better than him. Naruto appeared to be on the edge of tears, sacrificing his morals in such a cruel manner, but he also appeared resolute and determined, prepared to keep his word, no matter the cost. Sasuke had never been more proud of himself or more sorry for the choices he had to make all the time. Perhaps the peace they had hesitantly discovered at the end of the Fourth War would return to them one day. He fervently hoped so for Naruto's sake. They needed to plan an assassination in the interim. Kakashi cursed himself for being a coward once more. He stood across the street from the Junin standby station entrance, which was actually just a lounge with a fully stocked bar and booths decorated with the best privacy seals available. He wasn't lurking, despite what Sasuke had claimed earlier that day. You might wonder why he was just standing there. Easy, because there was a Sarutobi named Asuma in that building right now, looking very young and laughing while Genma told a story. He had his arm thrown over Kurenai's shoulders with ease. And, above all, appearing alive. Anyone who knew Kakashi knew that he struggled to accept the deaths of his fellows. Asuma's had been one of the easiest for him to deal with out of all of them. They were and he were friends, not because he didn't care or because they weren't. However, Asuma had left behind a team that required direction and support, and Kakashi had no time to grieve his loss because he had children to care for, a distressed and pregnant Kurenai to visit, and Naruto and the Akatsuki to worry about. Then, everything had happened so fast, fight after fight, mission after mission. But all of a sudden, the dead were rising, a war was going on, his best friend wasn't as dead as he'd been thinking for the past 10 years, and he had to deal with a real god. Asuma wasn't the only name on the list, and he wasn't the most recent by far, once he'd had a chance to sit back and consider the losses. The grief had subsided into the dull ache that he knew from experience would never truly go away because it had been so long. Even though that was absurd, Kakashi had felt bad about it. Because Kakashi should have been spared the suffering that Asuma's death should have caused. Simply because there had been more significant events, he should not have been relegated to the background. Perhaps it was nonsensical, but the guilt was still there. And yet here Kakashi was, years ago, watching through a window as Kurenai giggled beside him and Asuma threw his head back in a belly laugh, both of them appearing so alive, carefree, and vibrant. How should he confront them? He would disappoint them both in a spectacular way. Kurenai was left to raise their child by themselves after Asuma passed away. With that knowledge, how could he enter and talk to them? How could he not see Asuma's face, pale and bloody in death, when he looked into his eyes? A cheerful voice from his side said, You know, somehow I always seem to forget just how angsty you are, and he looked down to meet Sakura's green eyes in surprise. Even though her words were light, her face was serious as she looked back evenly. They probably already know you're out here, that you've been out here for the last week, and they're going to start to get suspicious soon. Aren't you the one who lectured us about avoiding that? Kakashi complained. When they threw his words back in his face like that, he detested it. Sakura tilted her head in thought. He's alive. He's alive and he's happy, and we have the chance to keep it that way. Ino's never gonna have to bury her sensei, not like that, not as long as I can help it. Kakashi sighed as she uttered the words in a steely voice, meaning each and every word. Yeah, he said, considering that he would do everything within his power to ensure it as well, but that doesn't mean I don't see him dying every time I look at him. He would never have confessed to as much if Sakura had truly been as young as she appeared. Hell, he wouldn't have even alluded to it when she was 16 or 17. However, they had fought a war together, witnessed their allies being mowed down like nothing, and been made to stand on the sidelines as liabilities and near dead weight while Naruto and Sasuke battled a god to decide the fate of the world. They had come to a mutual understanding during that period, and it was obvious that this understanding had persisted into the past. And I see Ino and Choji sobbing at his grave, Shikamaru cold and closed down, Kurenai Sensei devastated. I see Neji dead and Guy Sensei crippled, and so many others torn to shreds. I've passed so many shinobi that I recognize from my operating table, and some of them I was able to save, but most of them I wasn't. And I see them and I think about how they looked when they died, and I keep going. Sakura maintained eye contact while he swallowed somewhat grudgingly, because he didn't see sympathy there. It was neither contempt nor pity. This was her method of telling him to move on, not to get over it. This was comprehension. They're alive now, all of them. We have a chance to keep it that way. They didn't really say, we don't have much time. After all, there was a reason his children had made every effort to run themselves into the ground. The Chunin exams is in 5 months. Sakura shrugged, as if unconcerned, but he could see her eyes tighten at the words. Then we need to be ready, she said. Then she gave him a quirky smile. And we're not the only ones. It might be a good idea for some joint training, don't you think? Kakashi let out a sigh. He was aware that he had lost. In addition to being judged by Sakura, Sasuke, and possibly even Naruto for continuing to avoid Asuma, he would be endangering Team 10 by depriving them of the necessary training. Sage, but were his children proficient in hitting below the belt? When Sakura merely blinked up at him naively, he narrowed his eyes and asked, what are you doing here anyway? Aren't you lot supposed to be grocery shopping for a client? When they had really been 12, that look hadn't worked on him. Sakura, where are your teammates? Well, we were just concerned about you is all. You've been stalking Asuma Sensei for a while now, lurking around corners, and you're making Naruto sad. She actually sounded pretty upset about that last bit, and he couldn't blame her, so Kakashi winced. Since everyone, including Sasuke, had come to the conclusion that Danzo was a living, breathing corpse, Naruto had been feeling very depressed. If nothing else, he declared, I was not lurking, and don't think I didn't notice how you avoided actually answering the question. Where are they? She said, oh, we just decided to take him for ramen to cheer him up a bit, with ease. The mischief in her eyes told me that it was too easy. But it was your fault, you know, so it's only fair. A part of him wasn't sure if he truly wanted the answer to the question, what's fair? Dread was building up in his stomach. Before he could do more than gape at her, the pinkette lifted her hand and said, why, you're paying, of course, while holding his wallet out in plain sight. He didn't see her take his wallet, so for a moment he just looked at where she had been standing. Had those covert training games been a little more successful than he'd imagined, or had he really been that consumed by his thoughts, not angst, damn it. She had his wallet, anyway, and was presently taking it to the ramen shop, where an endless pit was waiting. Shish. T. Sakura. Get back here. The words are stuttering out around barely contained laughter, so, let me get this straight, you've been stalking us for a week because you wanted to ask if we'd do a joint training session with your team? Kakashi makes the feeble defense, I was not stalking you, and even he is aware of this. Asuma isn't even trying to hide her laughter anymore. You were following us around, lurking around corners, watching us through windows. How is that not stalking? Through gritted teeth, he asks, do you want to do the joint training or not? Why? Why is his embarrassment the focus of this week? Surely, he hasn't done anything to deserve this much loss of dignity? Before Asuma can finish his flirting, Kurenai interrupts, I think it's a wonderful idea, bless her. They've all had a bit of time to grow, Now, and it's good to not get comfortable in your sparring patterns. You can develop bad habits that way. In his overly enthusiastic manner, the taijutsu expert would lecture about precisely that. And you have been spending too much time with Guy, Kakashi drawls. Kurenai responds, well, when he can't find his best friend, he tends to get lonely, her smile still sweet, and Kakashi hardly suppresses a wince because, yes, Asuma wasn't the only person he'd been avoiding lately. He continues as though she hadn't said anything at all, refusing to feel any more guilty than he already does because that's what led him to this predicament in the first place. My team has training in the mornings that usually lasts until mid-afternoon and then they take their missions. Anytime after 3 is good. I could probably pull them on one of their days off, too, they wouldn't complain, but I can't clear out an entire day of training, they'd revolt. And when he made that statement, he wasn't lying. Whether he was a genin or a junin, they would tie him up and abandon him for dead if he attempted to tell them that he had no training. For that, even Asuma was giving him a disapproving look. You can't take away one of their days off, are you crazy? If I tried something like that, Ino would straight up murder me. And Shikamaru would help her hide the crime without a trace. Even Choji would probably be mad enough that he wouldn't try to stop them. Kakashi wasn't interfering with Team 10's relationship. My team probably wouldn't put up too much of a fuss, though Shino would recite the rulebook on mandatory days off from memory. Kiba would complain all day about how he was strong enough not to need extra training and Hinata would just give us a look. Look, she's very good at looking disappointed in you. She probably learned it from her father, though hers is much more effective, if you ask me. Yes, and don't touch Team Eiza. Just trust me when I say it's fine, so long as it's not taking away from their morning training. Yeah? I already have some ideas of what we can do. Have you started teaching them how to tree walk yet? Because there's this version of ninja tag that I came up with. Kakashi skillfully ignored the amused glances he was receiving from the other 2 Junin instructors as he continued to explain. Now, they could criticize him all they wanted, but he had seen fantastic results, and that was all that mattered to him. In either case, Kakashi's mission had been successful and the other 2 teams were in. And what if they had saved themselves later on with a little more training now? Then, even though he would never publicly acknowledge it, it was worth the humiliation of being called a stalker. Or, even at great personal risk, confess to his children that it wasn't the first time his friends had called him that and probably wouldn't be the last. Ino had been overjoyed when she was informed about the group training. She would have to endure timid Hinata and Shino's repulsive bugs, and she would have to deal with Forehead and those losers Naruto and Kiba, but she would also get to spend time with Sasuke-kun, and that, in her opinion, was worth it all. Even now, she wished she had been placed on the same team as her beloved. Whatever her heart longed for, she had known from the beginning that it was unlikely. He had shut her down immediately and refused to budge, even as she threw a full-blown tantrum over not getting her way. Later, after she had calmed down, he had sat her down and explained why it was so important that the Ino Shikacho live on through them. She had only tried to talk her father into it once. She was so used to his inability to tell her no, especially when the puppy dog eyes came out, and she had even used a few tears for good measure. Although she hadn't fully understood, she had come to the realization that her fussing would not make a difference. However, that didn't mean she was thrilled about it. It was going as well as she had anticipated being on a team with Sloth Shikamaru and Blood and Choji. Both of them would much rather nap and eat on a rooftop or a hillside than ever train. Furthermore, Asuma Sensei was too relaxed to really enforce his will and had instead turned to bribing Choji with food, who would then turn to Shika in a pleading manner until the other boy grudgingly got to his feet. And even though Ino had grown up with them and they were now practically her brothers in blood, she still wanted to punch them in the face every single day. They were both people she loved. Therefore, it's true that she was more excited to see and train with Sasuke-kun than she had been in a long time. However, could that really be her fault? It was really just a bonus to be able to tell Forehead how much she had changed since graduating. Although the Pinkette may have won Kunoichi of the Year, Ino was a clan kid and had more than one teacher now that she was formally a shinobi. Perhaps it was unjust and utterly trivial, but ever since the announcement of the class rankings, she had been secretly furious. Even Ino would acknowledge that Sakura was intelligent, but that was all the girl was. Astute. She lacked strength, dexterity, endurance, a large chakra reserve, and even excellent aim. How, then? What made Sakura the year's best kunoichi? How? Ino knew deep down that it was because the academy concentrated on the fundamentals and Sakura was textbook perfect at them, even if she couldn't maintain it for very long or use them to win a taijutsu match. The truth was that Sakura had always been superior in academics. In other words, Ino was thrilled. And she remained thrilled until Team 10 arrived at the little clearing in the forest where they were all gathering and saw Team 7 for the first time in a month. It would have been an understatement to say that she was unable to speak. Because of the way all three genin were huddled together, heads bent in discussion, and not a single insult or dirty look seemed to be passing between them. It was more than just the new looks, though that was undoubtedly a factor. Sakura had chopped off almost all of her hair, and Naruto actually looked like a person and not a walking eyesore. The other two listened when one spoke. Preening and posturing were absent. Ino would assume that they had been a team for years rather than just a few weeks if she didn't know any different. Even Shika and Choji, whom she had known since they were in diapers, didn't get along. Not at all. What the devil was happening, then? Feeling rattled, Ino resorted to her pride and affection for the Uchiha heir as her strongest defense. When she eventually made her appearance known, she sneered, "What's this? Spend a few weeks with him and suddenly you think you're best friends? Forehead?" Perhaps her words were harsher than they needed to be, but she had never been so unsteady on her feet. She and her father were aware of the flaw and were working to fix it. The pinkette said, "Oh, hey, Ino.Pig," with a pleasant greeting, as if the Yamanaka's tone didn't bother her in the least. "You guys are kind of early. Team 8 shouldn't be here for another 10 minutes, at least." Asuma. Sensei leaned against a tree a few feet away from the others and lit a cigarette. "And I'm sure it'll be another 30 after that until Kakashi gets here, at least," he said, his amusement evident. Even though she was somewhat dazed, Ino couldn't resist making a face at him out of habit. As a last resort, assist her in persuading him to resign. Damn it, she didn't want to smell like tobacco for the next, however many years they were a team. Sakura's bright smile stretched across her face as she chirped, "If he knows what's good for him, he'll be here right on time." Ino stifled a shiver, but why? Had Sakura, teacher's pet, just gleefully threatened the sensei of her team? In front of an adult? Even Sasuke.Kun wasn't trying to hide his smirk, and Naruto was giggling. Ino paused to admire the beauty of that scene before pondering when the Uchiha began displaying feelings other than contempt, boredom, and arrogant superiority. Which all looked fantastic on him. However, she had been fairly certain that the boy's emotional spectrum was limited to that. Was this Forehead's doing? Sage? Were they forming a bond? Were they becoming more intimate? Had they spent their days off together, gone out to eat? Was Sasuke amused by Sakura? Was Ino losing? Once more, Naruto's voice interrupted Ino before she could have a nervous breakdown, saying, "Don't worry about it, TT Ibeo. Kaka. Sensei knows that this is important and he knows better than to cross an Uzumaki when things are important." Asuma. Sensei exhaled, looking split between amazement, horror, and laughter. "Oh, my god," he said. "It was you. You're the one that dyed his hair red." Ino turned to look at her teammates to see if they shared her perception. It should come as no surprise that Choji was eating a bag of chips. He appeared somewhat intrigued by what was happening, but he was primarily focused on his food. Shika, on the other hand, appeared completely absorbed, her eyes darting from person to person. As he attempted to figure out exactly what was going on, a line was clearly drawn between his brows in concentration. It said volumes that he hadn't said anything yet. Shikamaru was unable to pinpoint the reason behind most of his actions, but if there was one thing he detested, or adored, as Ino had never really figured that out, it was a mystery, because there wasn't much of one with his intelligence. He wasn't bothered by the fact that he wasn't supposed to know certain things or be privy to certain mission details. But a mystery like this, right in front of his eyes? Until he had discovered the truth, he was not going to let this one go. Asuma. Sensei's accusation caused Naruto to puff his chest out in evident pride, and their teacher burst into undignified laughter, barely keeping himself upright against his tree. At that moment, the man she assumes is the sensei of Team 7 emerges from the clearing, smoking and with his hair smoky, while the rest of him is drenched in water. He then leaps at the three genin, who don't even think twice before jumping into the trees behind them, their laughter resonating behind them. "Get back here, you little monsters. I won't forgive you for this." That book was an autographed first edition. When things still made sense, Ino kind of misses it. Kiba hadn't been overly worried when Kurenai Sensei had first informed them about the joint training with the other teams. It had appeared pretty clear that Team 8 would prevail. If Shikamaru had been able to muster the will to organize anything, he might have been an issue, but Kiba was skeptical that even Ino's constant yelling could do that. He could also acknowledge, if only to himself and Akamaru, that the Uchiha bastard was definitely someone to watch out for, but he reasoned that Sasuke would be sufficiently dragged down by his other two teammates for it to not really matter. He didn't dislike Naruto. Mind you, There was a reason he had been dead last in their class, even though the guy was generally cool enough. Thus, he and the rest of his team entered the clearing with the assurance that they would win in the end. Observing the bruised and scuffed state in which Team 7 was in. "Do you smoke?" Indeed, Naruto's jacket was emitting smoke. He had been even more certain. He was shocked to see how much his 3 former classmates had changed since he last saw them, but reassured. He was furious when it was revealed that they would be playing modified kid-friendly games. They weren't children, so what the devil? But if anything, that had only increased his sense of pride. They couldn't possibly lose now. Team 8's 3 generations were essentially designed for this. That's why Kiba was so irritated when they still hadn't located Team 7 an hour and a half later. Finding Team 10 had taken more than half an hour, which he attributed to Shikamaru exerting enough mental effort to locate a suitable spot for a nap. Shino and Hinata had looked for them first because he had assumed they would be the most difficult to locate. However, they had been doing nothing but practically running in circles. Kiba snarled, "I don't get it." He was becoming more and more animalistic the longer this took. "How the hell are they doing this? It's impossible. We're talking about Naruto here." Despite her strange crush, Hinata had to concede that he was correct, even though it seemed like she was itching to argue. She merely ducked her head in a silent nod at the end. "I agree," Shino said in his typical monotone, but with a noticeable hint of frustration. "Why? Because Naruto has proven himself to be extremely loud at all times." "Did they leave the training grounds? That weird scarecrow guy said it was against the rules?" As she activated her Kekkei Genkei, Hinata looked around, the veins around her eyes bulging. I'm sure if they did, Kuranai Sensei W. would have told us." A moment later, she shook her head silently, deactivating it as she had done every time she had tried. Nothing has changed. Despite having Shino's bugs scouting the area, they had also failed to find anything. Both Kiba and Akamaru knew from their clan training that smell could be blocked fairly easily, but there was usually something, even if it was just a whiff, that was too subtle to do much with. However, there was nothing at all. He simply didn't get it. How did they manage to block all 3 of them? How could they have remained so quiet that they were invisible for so long? How in the hell? The upbeat voice of Team 7's strange sensei exclaimed, "And that's time." Kiba let out a loud curse and barely held back from slashing out at a nearby bush. They walked silently back to the clearing where they had begun. When they got there, Team 10 was lounging on one side while the 3 teachers stood to the side, but Naruto, Sakura, and the Uchiha bastard were still nowhere to be seen. "All right, my clever little genin. Time to come out now." In the space between blinks, 3 more bodies emerged into the clearing. Kiba was simply relieved that he wasn't the only one who recoiled. Naruto complained right away, "That was so boring," but he didn't even try to cover up the broad smile that was plastered on his whiskered face. It was good practice, though. Patience is one thing we all tend to lack if we're not hyper-focused on something. Still, that was a challenge. Kiba spluttered for a moment. How? Since the clearing was not where they had landed. They were not there. They had been there before. And it appeared that until they had revealed themselves, nobody, not even their sensei, had noticed. However, upon closer inspection, he saw that scarecrow. Sensei didn't even appear startled. "How the hell did you do that?" "That would be because of these," Naruto exclaimed as he rose his arm to display what appeared to be a seal on a tiny square of thick paper. "My newest masterpiece." But there's no way. There's ways around seals like that. And besides, Hinata couldn't find you either. No way were you blocking us out. "Well, duh. Only an idiot would try to block the Byakugan instead of finding a way around it. And nothing is more obvious than the absence of something. I'm smarter than that, Datbeo." The Uchiha sighed, rolling his eyes and turning away as if the entire conversation was over. "Just say it plainly, idiot. They're not going to understand otherwise," he said. Kiba would be much more offended by that if he weren't so eager to get answers to his questions. Priorities, though. He wouldn't even be able to hold his mother accountable if he left this clearing without knowing the specifics of what Naruto had done. Naruto sighed and turned back to them, adopting a tone Kiba had never heard the other boy use before. "Shut up, Teme, I was getting to it," he said. He sounded as though he was attempting to instruct them. "What on earth? Like I said, the absence of something is obvious. If we'd blocked everything, smell, sight, sound, chakra, you'd have noticed pretty quickly there was a hole, I guess. A nothingness. So, instead, I came up with this little beauty." Though the blonde didn't keep it motionless long enough for Kiba to see more than a few spirals and scribbles, The seal was once more displayed with an even more ostentatious flourish. In any case, he wouldn't be able to understand it. He had never been interested in Fuinjutsu because it was so dull. Instead of blocking, it blends and covers. Instead of 3 humans, you might as well have been looking for 3 trees, because that's what we would have seemed like to you while we were wearing these. The sensei of Team 10 interrupted, looking surprised and uncertain. That seems highly improbable, he said. Ignoring the doubt, Naruto simply shrugged at him. It worked, so obviously not. I wasn't sure it would at first, but, they didn't turn us into actual trees, so I was gonna take it as a win either way. That was an option? What the hell, Dobi? Don't be such babies, we're all fine, it's fine. As the 3 swiftly turned into a 3-way fight, the scarecrow sensei sighed and seemed to forget about the others, his one visible eye crinkling up into a smile. Aren't they just the cutest little genin you've ever seen? So violent? In actuality, Team 7's fighting was arguably the most typical activity they had engaged in all afternoon. Furthermore, they weren't even acting malevolently. He could see that everyone, including Sasuke, was smiling even from this distance. Kiba had no idea that the bastard's face was capable of such a feat. As soon as it became clear that no one else would, Kuranai sensei interrupted, that doesn't explain how it could hide them from the Byakugan. Her gaze briefly shifted to Hinata's stooped figure. And that's kind of important to know. Sakura locked him in a headlock as Sasuke seized his arms, and Naruto hesitated, hardly responding. Oh, well, I can't tell you specifics, but basically everything alive has a chakra signature, and so I just made ours resemble a tree's. It wasn't too difficult, really, you just have to know what you're mimicking. Hinata's face turned a frightening shade of red as Naruto's gaze fell upon her, and she squeaked, B. But Kiba was certain that she would either stop or faint instantly. Instead, he couldn't help but feel proud of her as she plowed ahead. B. But you'd have to know exactly W. What they looked like. TH. The chakra S. Systems. IW. Would have been able T.tot. Tell fake ones. Naruto appeared to be attempting to tilt his head, but Sakura's persistent hold on his neck prevented him from doing so. But I do. Why was he still talking as if they were all seated for tea and he wasn't being restrained by his teammates? Know what they look like. Obviously. Otherwise I wouldn't have been able to trick you. Sakura finally let go, seemingly giving up since she wasn't receiving the response she desired. I think she means how, Naruto, she explained. She's worried because you found a work around for her Kekkei Genkai. I know you don't want them to know what the seal is, specifically, but it'd be a good idea to at least tell them how. Oh, well, that's because of my own Kekkei Genkai, kinda? Except it's not really? That's the best way to explain it, though. I can sense chakra, too. Mapping it is a little more difficult, but I'm getting better, especially when Teme here helps me with it. TCH. Uzumaki have always been known for being chakra powerhouses, but we also tend to be pretty chakra sensitive, too, he continued with a smile, slicing through his teammates' jeering. It doesn't always manifest in the same way, and it can take a bit of an outside nudge to awaken the ability, I guess, which is why I sucked so bad with it before I got some decent training. With no carefree slouch in sight, Asuma demanded, so, you're saying anyone with a good sensing ability and a bit of imagination could make a work around to one of Konoha's oldest Kekkei Genkai? The tension in the clearing practically exploded. Nearly everyone in the room was a high-ranking shinobi or a clan kid, and even Kiba lacked the haughtiness to brush off such a threat. As if he couldn't comprehend why they were all freaking out over this, Naruto simply kept blinking at them with that dumb, blank expression of bewilderment. Kiba was aware that the man was a moron, but this was absurd. He must have understood why this could be somewhat problematic if it ended up in the hands of the enemy. I mean, that plus a completely instinctual grasp on master-level Fuinjutsu. I'm pretty sure not even the Sannin would, though. They're good, master-level for sure, but they don't have that extra that's needed to really make great seals. So, keep the weakness in mind, I guess, but it shouldn't be an issue on a level like these seals. Kiba couldn't even begin to explain how he was able to say all of that so casually, without even a trace of his typical ostentatious boasting. But that didn't mean he wasn't still annoyed by it. Are you claiming to be better than the Sannin? You dead last Naruto? In this, yes, he said abruptly, with a sour tone that Kiba was accustomed to hearing whenever his clan was disparaged for any reason. After saying, I'm an Uzumaki. Fuinjutsu is literally in my blood. He shrugged, once again looking carefree. But I'm willing to submit the blueprints to the Hokage if it'd make you feel better. Kiba was devastated. Where the hell did normal go? Sakura exclaimed, "I think that was a resounding success." As they walked through the streets, filthy and exhausted. The sun had started to rise a while ago, and everything was covered in a flaming orange hue. As the lights flickered on, the shadows grew deeper by the minute. The four of them marching on, covered in filth from head to toe, long after any other sane genin would have given up, had become such a familiar sight that the crowd now simply bustled past them. In fact, the majority weren't even giving Naruto a sidelong glance, much less a glare. Advancement. With his nose deep in his book, Kakashi Sensei asked sardonically, "You mean the fact that literally every single one of them looked like they were having an aneurysm as we left?" The man had come dangerously close to crying when they had disclosed that they hadn't destroyed his book, this time. "It builds character," Sasuke told Kakashi solemnly. "Some people just want to watch the world burn," managing to maintain a composed expression while his fellow genin erupted in hysterics during the delivery. After he had sufficiently calmed down, Naruto said, "Well, it got their attention, didn't it? They're gonna think about how good we've gotten. And they're gonna want to catch up. That's what this whole thing was supposed to be for, right?" Kakashi Sensei sighed in agreement. "Yes, fine," she said. "A resounding success it is."
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.